Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I'm not the type to make up stories, never have been. I'm a hunter from White County, Arkansas, and have been since I was just a kid following my dad through the woods. But what happened on Christmas Day in 2015, I still can't explain it. I've only told a couple of close friends, and they think I'm crazy or was hallucinating from the cold. Maybe writing it down will help me process it. Maybe someone else has seen something similar. That morning started like any other hunting day. My wife and kids were busy with her parents who were visiting for Christmas, so I figured I'd slip out for a few hours to get some alone time and maybe bring home some meat. We'd already done presents and breakfast, so I headed out around 11 in the morning to a public hunting area near Searcy I'd been to dozens of times before. It was unusually warm that Christmas, probably mid-50s, but I still wore my usual camo and orange vest. I brought my Remington 700 with a scope and a high-powered flashlight attached to the barrel. I wasn't planning on staying until dark, but you never know. I also had my backpack with some water, jerky, my hunting knife, and a few other essentials. The hunting area was pretty deserted, which wasn't surprising considering it was Christmas Day. Most folks were home with their families. I hiked about a mile in, found a good spot overlooking a small clearing and set up. I was hoping to bag a deer, but after a couple hours I hadn't seen much besides a few squirrels and some birds. Around 3 in the afternoon, I decided to move to a different location closer to a creek where I'd had luck before. The woods were quiet, that comfortable kind of quiet where you can hear every twig snap and leaf rustle. I remember checking my phone and seeing a text from my wife asking when I'd be home, and I replied I'd be back for dinner around 6. I found a fallen log about 20 yards from the tree line and sat down, rifle across my lap. The sun was starting to get lower, but I still had a good 3 hours of daylight left. I'd been sitting there maybe 15 minutes when it happened. Something hit me in the side of my head. Hard. Not hard enough to knock me out, but enough to make me see stars for a second. I grabbed the spot, right above my right ear, and felt something wet. Blood. When I looked down, there was a rock about the size of a baseball on the ground next to me. My first thought was that some kids were messing around in the woods. I was pissed. I jumped up, grabbed my rifle, and turned on the flashlight attachment even though it was still daylight. "Who's there?" I shouted. "You could have seriously hurt me." No answer, just the woods. I raised my rifle and swept the beam across the tree line, figuring whoever threw the rock was hiding there. That's when I saw it. Behind a big oak tree about 30 yards away, something was watching me. At first, I only caught the movement, something large shifting its weight. I focused the light and the rifle scope on that spot, and what I saw, it wasn't human. Not an animal I recognized either. I could only see part of it. A massive, hairy arm and part of a face peering around the tree. The face is what got me. It had deep-set eyes that reflected my light like a deer's would, but the face was almost human-like, but flatter, with a pronounced brow ridge. The hair covering it was dark brown, almost black. As I stood there, frozen, it made a sound I'll never forget. A low, rumbling growl that turned into a high-pitched scream that made my hair stand on end. It was nothing like any animal I'd ever heard in these woods. Not a bear, not a mountain lion, nothing natural. I panicked. I'm not proud of it, but I fired a shot at the tree where its arm was visible. The crack of the rifle echoed through the woods, and the creature jerked back. I'm pretty sure I hit it, or at least grazed it, because it let out another scream, angrier this time, and then it was gone. Moving faster than anything that size should be able to move, crossing a small valley to my right. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold my rifle. I should have left right then, should have gone straight back to my truck and driven home and forgotten all about it. But I didn't. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was the hunter in me wanting to know what I'd shot at. But I walked over to that tree. There was blood on the bark about 7 feet up, higher than any man I know. And caught in a rough patch of bark were some coarse, dark hairs, longer than my finger. I put a few in a small plastic bag I had in my pocket. I sometimes collect interesting feathers or plants to show my kids. I stood there looking at the blood, trying to process what I'd seen. In my mind I was thinking Sasquatch or Bigfoot, but that was crazy, right? Those things don't exist. But what else could it be? It wasn't a bear on its hind legs. It wasn't a man in a suit. I know what I saw. The smart thing would have been to leave, but I didn't. Instead, I followed the direction it had gone. I know. Stupid decision. But I was in some kind of shock, I think, not thinking clearly. I kept my rifle ready and moved slowly through the underbrush, following what looked like broken branches and disturbed ground. After about half a mile, I came to a small clearing surrounded by thick pines. The smell hit me first, like wet dog mixed with rotting meat and something musky I can't even describe. Then I saw the structure. It was like a massive teepee made of branches and small trees, at least 10 feet tall. Around it were scattered animal bones, deer mostly, but some smaller animals too. Some looked fresh. Some had been there a while. I was backing away slowly when I heard movement behind me. I spun around, raising my rifle, and that's when I realized how badly I'd messed up. There wasn't just one of them, there were 3. The largest one, I'm guessing it was the one I'd shot at earlier, was standing about 15 yards away. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark brown hair with patches of grey. Behind it was another one, slightly shorter but broader in the shoulders. And to their right was a smaller one, maybe 6 feet tall with reddish-brown hair. A juvenile, a family. I had stumbled onto a family of whatever these things were, and I had shot at one of them. The big one's arm had a dark streak on it that I'm pretty sure was blood from where my bullet had grazed it. In the fading daylight, their eyes caught what little light was left, giving off that same reflective quality I'd noticed earlier. All 3 were staring directly at me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My finger was on the trigger, but I knew my rifle wouldn't save me, not against 3 of them, not when they could move that fast. For what felt like forever, but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds, we just stared at each other. I could hear their breathing, heavy, rhythmic. The big one made a low sound in its throat, and the smaller one stepped back slightly. Then something happened that I still can't explain. The big one, the one I had shot, just turned away. It made a grunting noise, and the other 2 turned as well. They walked away into the thick woods, disappearing within seconds despite their size. They let me go. They could have torn me apart, but they chose not to. I don't remember much about getting back to my truck. I ran most of the way, falling several times, constantly looking over my shoulder. My mind was racing with what I'd seen. When I finally reached my vehicle, I threw my gear in, locked the doors, and sat there shaking for a good 20 minutes before I could even start the engine. I drove home in a daze. My wife asked about the scratch on my head, and I told her I'd walked into a branch. I couldn't tell her the truth, couldn't tell anyone really. Who would believe me? The hair samples I collected, I still have them, locked in my gun safe. I've thought about sending them somewhere for testing, but I'm afraid of the ridicule. Afraid of being labeled the crazy guy who thinks he saw Bigfoot on Christmas Day. But I know what I saw. I know what happened. Sometimes I still wake up hearing that scream, seeing those eyes reflecting in the darkness. I haven't been back to that hunting spot since. Haven't hunted alone at all, to be honest. Why am I sharing this now? I don't know. Maybe because I need someone to believe me. Maybe because I need to know if anyone else has seen them. All I know is that there's something out there in the woods of White County that science can't explain, and it's smart enough to communicate, to live in family groups, to build shelters, and to show mercy to someone who probably didn't deserve it. I still hunt, but never alone. and never in that area. Sometimes when I'm in the woods, I get the feeling I'm being watched. And sometimes I hear rocks hitting trees in the distance, like something sending a message. Whatever they are, they're out there. And they know we're here too. Story 2. I've been debating whether to post this for years. Part of me still can't believe what happened, and another part just wants to forget it all. But after seeing other stories on here about similar experiences, I thought it might help to finally get this off my chest. This happened back in the summer of 2015, when I was 16. My family has this huge property near the Cascade foothills in Oregon. About 1,500 acres of mostly forest land that's been in our family for generations. I'd grown up hunting, fishing, and camping on that land, so I knew it like the back of my hand. At least, I thought I did. That summer, I convinced my parents to let me do a month-long solo camping trip on the property. I'd been begging them for years, and they finally agreed since I'd proven myself on shorter trips. My dad made me take a sat phone, a gun, just a .22 rifle for small game and protection from coyotes, extra emergency supplies, and he promised to check in every few days. Standard precautions, but nothing that worried me. I picked this perfect spot on a small peninsula formed by one of the creeks that runs through our property. It was about 2 miles from the main cabin, secluded, but not too far in case of emergency. I'd camped there with my dad and grandpa tons of times. It had good fishing, a clean water source, and was on higher ground so it wouldn't flood if it rained. The first day started out normal. I hiked in, set up my tent, organized my supplies, and started a small fire to cook dinner. But as the afternoon wore on, I noticed something weird. The woods were completely silent. No birds chirping, no squirrels chattering, nothing. I've spent my whole life in these woods, and they're never quiet like that. There's always some kind of background noise. I tried to brush it off, telling myself maybe a cougar or bear had passed through recently and scared everything away. But deep down, something felt off. It was like that feeling when you think someone's watching you, but nobody's there. As the sun started to set, I was sitting by my fire eating some fish I'd caught earlier when I heard it. This deep, weird breathing sound coming from across the creek. It wasn't an animal sound I recognized, and I know what bears, cougars, and coyotes sound like. This was different. It was rhythmic and deliberate, if that makes sense. Like something breathing heavily on purpose, wanting me to hear it. I called out thinking maybe it was my uncle or cousin playing a prank, but nobody answered. Then I heard wood knocking, not like a woodpecker, but like someone taking a stick and hitting it against a tree trunk. 3 distinct knocks, pause, then 3 more. My blood ran cold. I'd heard stories about wood knocking being associated with Bigfoot, but I'd always thought that was just campfire tales. I loaded my rifle and kept the fire going strong, hoping whatever it was would stay away. Around midnight, I was almost asleep in my tent when I heard a scream that made my heart stop. It sounded like a woman being murdered. This high-pitched, blood-curdling shriek that echoed through the trees. It was maybe 100 yards away from my camp. I'd heard that mountain lions can sound like women screaming, so I tried to convince myself that's all it was. But 10 minutes later, the scream came again, and it was closer, much closer, maybe 50 yards from my tent. I grabbed my rifle and sat up all night with my flashlight, jumping at every sound. When morning finally came, I was exhausted, but too wired to sleep. I seriously considered packing up and heading back to the cabin, but I didn't want to look like a coward. I'd been bragging about this trip for months. Plus, my dad wasn't scheduled to check on me until the next day, and I didn't want to use the sat phone for what might just be my imagination running wild. That morning, I noticed this awful smell hanging in the air, like rotting meat mixed with skunk spray, but worse. It was so strong it made my eyes water. Following my nose, I walked to the edge of my peninsula and found something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. Massive footprints, at least 18 inches long, pressed deep into the mud by the creek. They led straight toward my campsite. I took pictures with my phone, but they came out blurry because my hands were shaking so bad. The tracks were fresh, probably from that night. Whatever made them was huge, way bigger than any human I've ever seen. I spent the day fishing and trying to distract myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I turned around, I expected to see something staring back at me from the tree line. The woods stayed unnaturally quiet all day. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. That night was even worse. The breathing sound started again across the creek, but this time they were closer. I could hear branches breaking as something moved around in the darkness. I kept my fire blazing and my rifle ready. Around 11 at night, that terrible scream ripped through the darkness again, so close it felt like it was right outside my tent. Then I heard something massive splashing through the creek, like something weighing hundreds of pounds was crossing the water toward my camp. I fired a warning shot into the air, and whatever it was crashed back through the woods away from me. I didn't sleep a wink that night. The next morning, my dad and uncle showed up on ATVs to check on me. I was a mess, red-eyed, jumpy, and probably looking half crazy. But I didn't tell them what happened. I was 16, trying to prove I was a man. The last thing I wanted was for them to think I was scared of the dark or making up stories. "Everything going okay, son?" my dad asked, looking concerned. I nodded and forced a smile. "Yeah, just didn't sleep great. New environment and all." My uncle walked around the camp, looking at my setup. He paused near the creek bank, staring at the ground where I'd seen the tracks. His expression changed, but he didn't say anything. They stayed for lunch, and I almost broke down and told them everything. But my uncle started telling stories about his own solo camping trips as a teenager, and I felt like I'd look like a total wimp if I admitted I was scared. After they left, things got so much worse. I was filtering water at the creek when I heard something splash on the other side. I looked up, but couldn't see anything through the thick brush. Then I went back to my camp and shook my water tablet bottle. It makes this distinct rattling sound. Immediately, from across the creek, something perfectly mimicked the exact sound. Not similar, identical. Like it was mocking me. My hands started shaking so bad I dropped the bottle. That's when another scream erupted from just across the creek, maybe 30 yards away. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle and scanned the opposite bank. And that's when I saw it. Standing in the creek, partially hidden by branches but clearly visible, was this thing. It had to be at least 10 feet tall, covered in dark hair or fur. It was standing upright on two legs, with arms that hung down almost to its knees. I could see the outline of its massive shoulders and head in my flashlight beam. Its eyes caught the light and glowed, this yellowish-orange reflection that still haunts my dreams. For maybe 3 seconds, we just stared at each other. Then I fired my rifle into the air, not at it, just out of pure terror. It let out this deep, guttural sound, not a scream, more like a roar, and crashed away through the woods. At almost the same moment, I heard branches breaking behind me from the opposite direction. Something else was approaching my camp from behind. I was about to run when I heard ATV engines in the distance. My grandpa and uncle came tearing into my camp, headlights blazing. I don't think I've ever been so happy to see anyone in my life. "Get on!" my grandpa yelled. He didn't need to tell me twice. As I jumped on the back of his ATV, my uncle asked, "Did you hear it?" I nodded, too terrified to speak. "We heard the screams from the cabin," my uncle explained as we sped away. "Your grandpa said we needed to come get you now." When we got back to the cabin, my whole family was there. My grandpa sat me down and asked me to tell them everything. When I finished, the adults exchanged looks. "It's happened before," my grandpa finally said. "Not often, but every generation or so. We should have warned you." The next day, my dad, uncle, and 2 family friends went back to get my gear. They came back white-faced. My campsite had been completely destroyed, tent shredded, supplies scattered everywhere, and my cooler had been smashed to pieces. They brought back what they could salvage, which wasn't much. That was 13 years ago. I still can't. explain what happened, and I don't really try to anymore. All I know is something was out there that shouldn't exist according to science. I'm 29 now, and I still sleep with a nightlight. I've never gone camping alone since, and I probably never will. Even group camping trips make me nervous. I don't tell many people this story because most just think I'm making it up or was a scared kid seeing things. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And sometimes at night, I still wake up in a cold sweat thinking I hear wood knocking or that woman-like scream outside my window. I don't care if people believe in Bigfoot or not. I never did before that summer. But something is out there in those woods. Something that watches, mimics, and hunts. Something that knows we're there long before we know it's there. So if you're ever camping in the Cascades and the woods go silent, or you hear wood knocking or something that sounds like a woman screaming, pack up and get out. Don't wait until morning. Don't try to be brave. Just go. Because by the time you see it, it's already too close. Story 3. I've never really told this story to anyone outside my family. For a long time, I couldn't even talk about it without getting goosebumps. Even now, 40-something years later, I still get a chill when I think about that night at my dad's place in Fort Assiniboine. It was the fall of 1978, and I was just 7 years old. My parents had divorced earlier that year, and my dad had built what he always called our dream home out in the middle of nowhere in Alberta. It was this beautiful house with these massive glass windows across the front, perched on this hillside overlooking dense forest. You couldn't see another house for miles. The property backed onto the Assiniboine River, and it was honestly the kind of place that looked magical during the day, but became eerie at night. I lived with my mom in Barhead most of the time, about an hour's drive away, but every second weekend, I'd go stay with my dad. I actually loved those weekends. We had horses and chickens, and I'd spend hours playing in the woods. My dad always warned me not to wander too far, because we'd often find bear tracks on the property. That was just normal life out there. This particular weekend was in late October. The weather had turned cold, and the leaves had mostly fallen. My dad had picked me up from school on Friday afternoon, and we'd driven out to his place as usual. I remember he seemed a bit on edge that weekend. He mentioned that some of the neighbors had spotted a grizzly bear in the area, and we needed to be extra careful. No wandering off, no leaving food outside, all that stuff. Saturday was pretty normal. We fed the horses, collected eggs from the chickens, and I helped my dad stack some firewood for winter. That night we had dinner, watched some TV, and I went to bed around 9. My bedroom was down a hallway from the main living area, which had those floor-to-ceiling windows I mentioned. My dad's bedroom was actually a loft area above the living room, so he could see down into the main space from his room. I fell asleep quickly that night. I was tired from being outside all day, but I woke up suddenly around 11:30 to this weird noise coming from the front of the house. At first, I thought maybe it was just the wind. It was a blustery night. But then I heard this distinct thumping sound, like something was actually hitting the deck outside. Then there was this rustling noise, like something moving through the trees just beyond the deck. I sat up in bed, feeling that prickly sensation you get when you're scared but curious at the same time. Dad had always told me to stay in my room if I heard anything weird at night, but something about these sounds made me get out of bed. I crept down the hallway toward the living room, my bare feet silent on the wooden floor. The living room was dark, except for this faint blue glow from the digital clock on the VCR. As I got closer, I could make out the silhouette of something outside on the deck. I froze about 15 feet away from the big windows, just at the edge of the hallway. There was definitely something out there, something big. It was hunched over, like it was examining something on the deck. In the darkness, I couldn't make out details, but I could tell it was much larger than any animal I'd ever seen around our property. Then I heard my dad moving around upstairs. He must have heard the noise too. I stood completely still, afraid to move. My dad appeared on the balcony of his loft, looking down toward the windows. Without saying anything, he reached over and flipped on the exterior lights. What happened next is something I've replayed in my mind thousands of times over the years. The thing on our deck stood up. It just stood up and kept standing up. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I recognized. It was enormous, taller than my dad, taller than any person I'd ever seen. It was covered in dark hair or fur, but it stood on two legs with this eerily human-like balance. Its proportions were all wrong for a bear, the arms too long, the legs too straight. My dad shouted something at me. I think he was telling me to go back to my room, but I couldn't move. I was completely frozen. I remember my dad scrambling back into his bedroom and returning seconds later with his shotgun. He yelled at me again, definitely telling me to get back to my room now, his voice cracking with panic. The creature turned toward the house, and even though I couldn't see its face clearly in the shadows, I felt like it was looking right at me. My dad aimed the shotgun down toward the windows, shouting that he was going to shoot through the glass. Then the thing moved. It moved so fast I could hardly process what I was seeing. It vaulted over the railing of our deck. We were on a hillside, remember? So that drop was a good 12 feet or more, and it just raced up the hill toward the ridge. It moved in this fluid, powerful way that was nothing like how a bear moves. It was upright the whole time, running on two legs. My dad was still shouting, and I finally managed to turn and run back to my room. I dove under the covers and stayed there, shaking. A few minutes later, my dad came in. His face was white, and his hands were trembling as he sat on the edge of my bed. "Did you see that?" I whispered. He just nodded and told me everything was okay, that it was gone now. He asked if I was all right, and I told him I was. But then I asked what it was. "Probably just a bear," he said, but his voice sounded strange, like he didn't believe it himself. "It wasn't a bear, Dad," I said. "It looked like a gorilla." That was the only reference point my 7-year-old brain could come up with. He didn't argue with me. He just told me to try to go back to sleep and that he'd stay up and keep watch. He left my bedroom door open and kept the hallway light on. I didn't sleep at all that night. I could hear my dad on the phone, talking in a hushed voice. I caught fragments of conversations. He called several neighbors, and I heard him say things like, "on my deck," and "stood up," and "faster than anything I've ever seen." At one point, I distinctly heard him use the word Sasquatch. It was a word I'd heard before. There were always stories about Bigfoot sightings in the newspapers, but I'd never thought they were real, just scary stories people told. The next morning, everything felt off. Dad made breakfast like normal, but he kept looking out the windows. Around mid-morning, a couple of his friends showed up. They walked around the property with my dad, looking at the ground. I watched from the window as they pointed at something near the deck and then followed a trail up the hillside. When they came back inside, they were talking in those quiet, serious adult voices. One of them had a shotgun that he propped by the door. They kept using words like prints and stride length. One of them asked me what I'd seen, but my dad cut him off, saying we didn't need to talk about it anymore. That afternoon, more people came over. Men with rifles who spread out across our property. They were looking for something, though no one would tell me exactly what. I overheard one of them tell my dad they'd found tracks nearly 18 inches long. As evening approached, I noticed my dad doing something he'd never done before, drawing all the curtains closed. Our house was so isolated that we never bothered with curtains. The glass windows were a feature, not something to cover up. But that night, every window was covered. My grandfather showed up before dinner. He brought his big hunting rifle, the one he used for moose, and set it next to his chair. After I went to bed, I could hear them talking in low voices in the living room. My grandfather stayed the night, sleeping in a chair positioned to face the front windows, the curtains slightly parted so he could see out. He didn't sleep much. Whenever I woke up during the night, I could see him still sitting there, rifle across his lap. The next day, Sunday, was when I was supposed to go back to my mum's. My dad seemed torn about whether to take me home or not. In the end, he decided we should go, but my grandfather stayed behind at the house. On the drive to Barhead, I asked my dad again what we had seen. "Dad, was that a Sasquatch?" I asked. He was quiet for a long time before answering. "I don't know what it was, honey, but whatever it was, it had no business being on our deck." "Are we going to tell Mom?" He looked at me then, his expression serious. "I think it's better if we don't talk about this too much. People don't always understand these things." When we got to my mom's, I heard my dad tell her there had been a bear on the property and that he'd scared it off. He asked her to keep me in town for the next couple of weekends until things calmed down. For a while after that, whenever I visited, things were different. My dad installed motion detector lights all around the property. The curtains stayed closed at night. He got a second dog, a big German Shepherd, and for that whole winter my grandfather's rifle stayed by the front door. I tried telling my mom what I'd really seen, but she dismissed it as my imagination. My dad never wanted to discuss it either, but I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person in a costume. It was something else entirely. Years later, when I was a teenager, I brought it up with my dad again. We were sitting on that same deck on a summer afternoon, and I asked him if he remembered that night. "I remember," he said quietly. Then, after a long pause, "You know, I've hunted in these woods my whole life. I know every animal that lives here. What we saw that night, that was something else." "A Sasquatch?" I pressed. He just looked at me with this expression I'll never forget, part resignation, part wonder. "Once you see one," he finally said, "there's no going back. You can't unsee it. I'm 49 now, and I've never seen anything like that creature again. But I still get uneasy in dense forests at night. And whenever I hear stories about Bigfoot sightings, I don't laugh like most people do, because I know there's something out there in the woods, something that stands upright and moves with incredible speed, something that comes to visit remote houses with big glass windows in the dead of night. And sometimes when I'm falling asleep, I still imagine I hear thumping on a deck and the rustling of trees. Some things you just never forget, no matter how much time passes." Story 4. I've been debating whether to share this for months now. I'm not the type who goes looking for the paranormal or believes every bump in the night is something otherworldly. I've always considered myself pretty grounded. I work in accounting, for crying out loud. But what happened last October has been eating at me, and I need to get it off my chest. Maybe someone here has experienced something similar. My wife and I live in a house that sits on a high promontory overlooking a valley in western Oregon. It's beautiful, secluded enough to feel peaceful, but not so remote that we're completely isolated. We've been here for almost 11 years now. The property backs up to hundreds of acres of forest land, and our south-facing windows and deck have this sweeping view of the valley below. It's why we bought the place. That night, October 23rd, we were coming back from dinner with friends in town. Nothing special, just a Friday night get-together at this Italian place we like. We pulled into the driveway around 9 in the evening. It was that perfect fall weather, crisp and cool, where you need a jacket but it's not freezing yet. The moon was nearly full and the sky was clear, but once you got under the tree canopy near our house, it was pretty dark. We have this routine whenever we come home. I unlock the door, step in first, flip on the living room light, and my wife follows behind me. She usually takes longer because she has to gather her purse, phone, sometimes a takeout box or whatever. That night, she was also wearing this long wool coat that she always struggles to get off the hanger in our entryway closet. So I'm standing there in the living room, waiting for her, and I glance out through our south-facing windows that overlook the deck. Force of habit, I always scan the property when we get home, especially at night. That's when I saw it. There was a figure walking past our windows. Not quickly, not slowly, just purposefully. walking from left to right across our deck. My first thought was that someone had broken into our house while we were gone, and we'd interrupted them leaving. But in the split second it took for that thought to form, I realized this wasn't a person, not a human anyway. The deck lights weren't on, and the only illumination was from our living room light spilling out the windows in the moonlight. But it was enough to see that whatever was walking past was massive, tall, I'd estimate 7 feet at minimum, and broad, not fat but solid, with these powerful-looking shoulders. The entire body was covered in hair, short, sandy brown hair with these bizarre vertical wave patterns I could make out even in the poor lighting. The hair looked remarkably clean, not matted or dirty like you'd expect from a wild animal. The way it moved was what really got to me, completely upright on 2 legs, with this smooth, deliberate gait, arms swinging naturally at its sides. I froze, completely froze. My wife was still struggling with her coat in the entryway behind me, completely oblivious. I couldn't even call out to her. The whole sighting lasted maybe 3 seconds before it disappeared past the edge of our window view. When I finally found my voice, I rushed to the window, but whatever it was had already moved beyond my line of sight. I remember my hands were shaking as I fumbled with the deck door lock, but by the time I got outside there was nothing there. No sound of footsteps, no rustling in the underbrush below our deck where the land slopes down toward the valley. My wife thought I was losing it. "You saw a bear," she kept saying, "but I know what bears look like. We've had them on our property plenty of times. This wasn't a bear. Bears don't walk exclusively on their hind legs for extended periods, and they certainly don't have that smooth, human-like gait." Here's the thing. This wasn't the first strange occurrence we've had on our property. Over the years, we've heard some bizarre stuff, vocalizations that don't match any wildlife I'm familiar with. Not quite a howl, not quite a scream, almost like a wood knock, followed by a long, resonant call that echoes through the valley. We've also heard unexplained banging sounds around the house, especially at night, loud enough to wake us up, like someone deliberately striking wood against wood. What's weird is that these sounds always seem to happen between October and November, never during summer, rarely in the dead of winter. My wife used to dismiss it as branches falling or coyotes making weird noises, and honestly, I tried to convince myself of the same. But after what I saw that night, I've been connecting the dots. I think these creatures, and I'm convinced there's more than one, aren't permanent residents in our area. They're passing through seasonally, probably migrating south for winter. Our property sits directly on what appears to be a natural corridor for wildlife. We see deer using the same paths through our property year after year. Coyotes too, even the occasional black bear. They all follow the valley as a natural pathway. The night after the sighting, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying those few seconds in my mind, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. At around 3 in the morning, I got up and went downstairs to the living room, turned off all the lights, and just sat there in the dark, staring out those same windows. The moonlight illuminated the deck enough that I could make out the general shapes of our patio furniture. Nothing moved, but I had this overwhelming sensation of being watched. The hair on my arms stood up, and my mouth went completely dry. I sat perfectly still for almost an hour, just listening, watching. Then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic sound coming from the forest edge, maybe 50 yards from our house. It was like someone gently hitting 2 sticks together, but in a deliberate pattern. 3 quick taps, pause, 2 taps, long pause, then repeat. It continued for about 5 minutes, then stopped abruptly. Just as I was about to go back upstairs, thinking I'd imagined it, I heard a response from the opposite direction, the same pattern, but fainter, like it was coming from deeper in the valley. They were communicating with each other. I didn't tell my wife about this. She was already worried about my mental state after my bear sighting, as she kept calling it. But over the next few weeks, I started researching. I read about Bigfoot sightings in our region, about migratory patterns of known wildlife, about human perception in low-light conditions, anything that might explain what I'd experienced. The more I researched, the more convinced I became that what walked past our window that night wasn't anything officially documented by science. The height, the gait, the hair pattern, it all matched accounts I was reading from others who claimed to have seen similar creatures. 2 weeks after my sighting, I decided to set up a trail camera at the edge of our property, where the land starts to slope down into the valley. I told my wife it was to capture photos of deer or maybe get a good shot of the local fox family we occasionally spotted. She thought it was a harmless hobby, so she didn't question it. For 3 nights, the camera captured nothing unusual, just a few deer, a raccoon, the expected forest creatures. But on the 4th night, around 2 in the morning, something triggered the camera. When I checked the SD card the next day, my stomach dropped. The image was dark and a bit blurry, but unmistakable. Something very large was partially visible at the edge of the frame, moving just out of full view of the camera. All that was clearly captured was a section of what appeared to be a muscular, hair-covered limb, too large for any known wildlife in our area. The camera also recorded the audio of heavy footsteps moving away from the trigger zone, followed by that same wood-knocking sound I'd heard before. That night, I couldn't sleep again. I kept thinking about what might be out there, moving through our property, possibly watching our house. Around midnight, I heard 3 distinct knocks on the side of our house, not like branches falling or animals scratching, but deliberate, powerful strikes against the wooden siding. My wife woke up too that time. "What the hell was that?" she whispered. I tried to play it cool, suggesting it might be a branch or some ice falling from the roof, even though it wasn't cold enough for ice. She seemed to accept this explanation and fell back asleep quickly. I didn't. I lay awake, listening until dawn. The next day, I checked the side of the house where I'd heard the knocking. There were no broken branches nearby, nothing that could have fallen and hit the house with that much force. But what I did find sent chills down my spine. 3 small indentations in the wooden siding, evenly spaced, like someone had struck it with purpose. November came, and the strange occurrences gradually decreased. The knocking stopped. The trail camera captured nothing unusual. By mid-November, everything had returned to normal, reinforcing my theory about seasonal migration. It's been several months now, and I haven't seen or heard anything strange since that period in October and early November. But I can't stop thinking about it. Sometimes, when I look out our south-facing windows at night, I catch myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see that figure again. I've never been a believer in the paranormal or cryptids or whatever you want to call them. I'm still not sure what to believe. All I know is what I saw that night was real. It wasn't human, and it wasn't any recognized animal species I'm familiar with. As October approaches again, I find myself both dreading and anticipating the possibility of another encounter. I've set up more trail cameras this time. I've even installed a motion-activated floodlight on the deck. My wife thinks I'm going overboard with home security, but she doesn't understand. How do you explain to someone that you're not afraid of burglars or wildlife? You're preparing for the return of something science says doesn't exist. I still don't have a logical explanation for what walked past my window that night. I don't know if I ever will, but I know what I saw, and I know I'll be watching when October comes around again. Story 5. I still get this weird feeling in my gut when I think about that night in the Catskills. It's been over 40 years, but I remember it like it happened yesterday. I was 11 years old, and my sister Emma was 9. We were at our weekend house, this old farmhouse my parents had bought in South Court, New York, back in '78. When they first got the place, it was a complete wreck. The house was built in 1880 and looked every bit its age. Dad spent most weekends that summer fixing broken windows, patching the roof, and battling the mice who'd claimed it as their own. Mum was constantly scrubbing ancient wallpaper and refinishing floors. By October, they'd turned it into something livable. Nothing fancy, but comfortable enough to escape the city on weekends. That particular weekend started like any other. We left our apartment in Manhattan around 5 in the afternoon on Friday. The drive took longer than usual because of heavy rain, and we didn't arrive until around 9 at night. It was that perfect October weather, crisp and cool with leaves crunching underfoot. The kind of night where the air smells like wood smoke and wet earth. We were all starving by the time we got there. Mom and Dad immediately mixed themselves gin and tonics and went to relax in the living room while Emma and I made sandwiches in the kitchen. The kitchen was my favorite room in that house. It had this huge wooden table that had probably been there since the house was built, and these wide windows that looked out over the valley. During the day, you could see all the way down to the stream that ran through our property, but that night it was pitch black outside. No moon, no stars, nothing but darkness beyond the glass. The window became like a mirror, reflecting our faces and the warm yellow light of the kitchen. Emma was chattering about some school drama while I slathered mustard on my sandwich. I wasn't really paying attention to her. I was tired from the drive and just wanted to eat and go to bed. I remember glancing up at the window, expecting to see my own reflection. Instead, I saw it. My whole body went cold. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even breathe. There was a face staring back at me. Not a human face. It was massive, ape-like, but not like any ape I'd ever seen at the zoo or in books. The kitchen light spilled out into the darkness, illuminating this thing from below, casting weird shadows across its features. It had this incredibly broad face, with no neck that I could see. Just this head that seemed to connect directly to these enormous shoulders that extended beyond both sides of the window frame. The window was at least 4 feet wide. Its brow was heavy, jutting out over the eyes, which were just watching us. Not angry, not hungry, not anything really. Just observing, like we were exhibits in a zoo. That's what scared me the most, I think. The utter lack of expression, the calmness, like it had all the time in the world to stand there and watch us eat our sandwiches. I finally managed to make some kind of sound, not even a proper scream, just this strangled noise in my throat. I pointed at the window, my hand shaking so badly I knocked over my glass of milk. Emma turned around, and I'll never forget her face when she saw it. Her eyes went so wide, I thought they might pop out of her head. Then she screamed, a real scream, high and piercing, and I found my voice too. We both started yelling for our parents, stumbling backward away from the window, knocking over chairs in our panic. "Dad! Mom! There's something outside!" I heard their footsteps pounding down the hallway, my dad's voice calling, "What is it? What's wrong?" By the time they burst into the kitchen, the face was gone, just vanished. The window showed nothing but darkness again. There was something looking in the window. Emma was crying now, pointing with a shaking finger. It was huge. My dad's expression shifted from concern to skepticism in an instant. Something like what? A deer? A bear? "No," I insisted, my voice cracking. It was like a giant person or an ape, but huge. Its head filled the whole window. Mom put her arm around Emma, who was sobbing against her side. "Honey, we're pretty far from any zoo. There aren't any apes around here." "I know what I saw," I said, feeling that awful frustration kids feel when adults don't believe them. "It was looking right at us. It had this massive face with a huge brow, and it was covered in hair." Dad sighed, but he went to the mudroom and grabbed 2 flashlights from the drawer. "All right, let's take a look outside. Maybe it was a bear standing on its hind legs. They can look pretty human-like sometimes." Mum stayed inside with Emma, while Dad and I went out the back door. The night air hit me like a slap, cold and damp. Dad swept the flashlight beam across the yard, illuminating the fallen leaves and the edge of the woods beyond. I stayed close behind him, my heart hammering in my chest. We made our way around to the kitchen side of the house. The ground was hard from an early frost, with dead leaves covering everything. Dad shined the light up at the kitchen window, and that's when I realized something that made my blood run even colder. "Dad," I whispered, "the kitchen window is really high on this side." And it was. Our house was built into the hillside, so the kitchen was on the main floor. But on this side of the house, the basement was exposed. The kitchen window had to be at least 9 feet off the ground. Dad realized it too. He swept the flashlight around the area, beneath the window, looking for any sign that something had been there. But there was nothing. No footprints, no disturbed earth, nothing. "There's nothing here, Michael," he said finally. "Let's go back inside. You and Emma probably just saw a reflection or a shadow that looked weird. But I knew what I'd seen, and there was one detail I hadn't mentioned yet, one that seemed so bizarre I was afraid it would make my story sound even more unbelievable." When we got back inside, Emma had calmed down enough to sit at the table again, though she kept glancing nervously at the window. "Did you find anything?" Mom asked. Dad shook his head. "Not a trace. I think the kids just spooked themselves." "It was orange," Emma said suddenly, her voice small. Everyone looked at her. "What was orange?" Dad asked. "The monster," she said. "It had orange hair, bright orange, like a carrot." I felt a chill run through me because she was right. I hadn't mentioned that part, but the creature's hair had been a vivid orange color, not brown or black like you'd expect from a bear, or even the Bigfoot creatures I'd seen in books and TV shows. Dad laughed, but it sounded forced. "Orange. Well, that settles it. You two have been watching too many Halloween specials." Mum suggested we all have some hot chocolate and try to calm down. She kept saying things like, "It's an old house. It makes strange noises and plays tricks on your eyes." But I could tell she was unsettled by how specific our descriptions were and how genuinely terrified we'd been. We all slept in the living room that night. Dad said it was because the heating wasn't working well in the bedrooms, but I knew the real reason. None of us wanted to be alone in separate rooms. I barely slept. Every creak of the old house had me sitting bolt upright, straining my eyes in the darkness. I kept thinking about that face, those impassive eyes studying us through the glass, the impossible height it would have needed to be to peer into that window, the bright orange hair that made no sense for any animal I knew of. The rest of the weekend passed without incident. By Sunday afternoon, my parents had convinced themselves that Emma and I had just had some sort of shared hallucination or had mistaken a reflection for something sinister. They didn't bring it up again, and whenever we tried to talk about it, they would quickly change the subject. We went back to the city that evening, and life returned to normal. School, homework, TV shows, and the usual routine. Almost 2 weeks passed, and I had started to wonder if maybe my parents were right. Maybe our imaginations had run wild in that old, creaky house in the dark woods. Then one morning, Dad was reading the local South Court Gazette that we had delivered to our city apartment to keep up with news around our weekend house. He made this strange, choking sound that made Mom look up from her coffee. "What is it?" she asked. Dad's face had gone pale. He folded the paper quickly, but not before I caught a glimpse of the headline. "Local farmer reports strange creature stealing livestock." "Nothing," he said too quickly, "just some silly local news." But later, when my parents thought we were watching TV, I snuck into the kitchen and found the paper in the trash. I pulled it out and read the article. A farmer named Henry Radcliffe, whose property was less than 5 miles from our house, reported that something had broken into his hen house and killed several chickens. He claimed to have seen the culprit, a large, hairy creature that walked on 2 legs. The detail that made my stomach drop was his description of the animal's color, bright orange, like nothing I've ever seen before. I showed the article to Emma when our parents weren't around. She started crying again, and I made her promise not to tell Mom and Dad that we'd seen it. They would only dismiss it again, and honestly, I was afraid they might even sell the house if they thought there was something dangerous lurking in the woods. We kept going to that house on weekends for years. I never saw the orange creature again, though there were nights I'd lie awake, listening for heavy footsteps outside my window. Sometimes I'd convince myself I heard breathing, deep and rhythmic, just outside the walls, but I never worked up the courage to look. Emma and I are in our 50s now. Our parents sold the house after we both left for college, and I haven't been back to South Court in decades. But sometimes, when Emma and I get together for holidays, after a few drinks, one of us will whisper, "Remember the orange thing?" And we'll share that look, the one that acknowledges we both know what we saw was real, even if no one else ever believed us. I've researched over the years cryptid sightings, unidentified primates, even obscure mythology. I've never found anything that matches what we saw that night. No Bigfoot report mentions bright orange hair. No known ape species grows to that size with that coloration. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there in the Catskills, watching through windows at unsuspecting families. And sometimes, on dark nights when I can't sleep, I find myself avoiding looking at my own windows, afraid of what might be looking back. Story 6. I've never been one to believe in the supernatural or cryptids or any of that nonsense. I'm just a regular guy from central Illinois who loves hunting and spending time outdoors with my kids. But something happened back in 2006 that I still can't explain, and it's been eating at me for years. I figured I'd finally write it down. Maybe someone else has experienced something similar. It was early November, prime deer season near Springfield. I'd been taking my son Tyler, 11 at the time, and daughter Emma, 9, out hunting with me since they were little. Tyler had gotten his first deer the previous season, and Emma was still learning, but loved coming along. The weather was perfect that day. Crisp autumn air, around 40 degrees with patches of frost still on the ground when we arrived at our hunting spot before dawn. We'd been to this area before. It's a mix of public land and private property where I had permission to hunt, about 20 acres of dense woodland surrounded by farmland. Nothing remarkable about it. We parked our truck at the edge of the woods and hiked in about half a mile to our blind, which was positioned near a small clearing where deer often passed through. The morning was uneventful. We saw a few does, but nothing worth taking. Around midday, we decided to move to a different spot where I'd seen buck signs during scouting trips. The kids were getting restless anyway, and I figured the walk would do them good. We'd been at the new location for maybe an hour when a decent-sized buck stepped out about 60 yards away. Tyler was ready with his youth model 243, and I whispered instructions while Emma watched through binoculars. Tyler took the shot, and I could tell immediately it wasn't perfect. The deer jumped, kicked, and bolted into the thicker woods. "I think I hit him, Dad," Tyler said, his voice shaking with that mix of excitement and concern that hunters understand. I found blood at the spot where the deer had been standing, bright red and frothy, which usually means a lung shot, but not a clean pass-through. "Good shot, bud. He won't go far. Let's give him 20 minutes to bed down, then we'll track him." We waited, had some sandwiches and hot chocolate from our thermos, then began following the blood trail. It wasn't a heavy trail, but consistent enough to follow, droplets every few feet, occasional smears on leaves and twigs. We'd gone maybe 50 yards into thicker forest when everything changed. The blood trail continued, but something felt off. The woods had gotten quieter. I'm talking about that unnatural silence where you suddenly realize you can't hear birds or squirrels or anything. That's when we heard it. A loud, deliberate knocking sound, like someone taking a baseball bat to a tree trunk. Knock, knock, knock. 3 distinct sounds, evenly spaced, coming from somewhere to our right, maybe 100 yards away. I froze, scanning the trees. My first thought was other hunters, but something about the sound wasn't right. It was too powerful, too deliberate. "What was that, Dad?" Emma whispered, moving closer to me. Probably just another hunter, I said, trying to sound casual, but I didn't believe it. In 20+ years of hunting these woods, I'd never heard anything like it. We continued following the blood trail for another 20 yards when the knocking came again, this time from a different direction, closer, maybe 70 yards to our left. Knock, knock, knock. Then came the crashing. Something was moving through the underbrush with tremendous force, not like a deer or even a bear. This was violent, powerful movement that snapped branches and actually shook the smaller trees. Whatever it was big, and it wasn't trying to be quiet. The kids pressed against me, and I could feel them trembling. I'm not easily spooked, but I felt the hair on my neck stand up. Something was very wrong. "I think we should head back to the truck," I said, keeping my voice calm. "That deer's probably long gone with a wound like that." I didn't want to alarm the kids, but my instincts were screaming at me to get out of there. I shouldered my rifle and turned us around, trying to make it seem like a normal decision to abandon the tracking. The walk back was tense. I kept my eyes moving, scanning the trees, listening for anything unusual. The forest remained unnaturally quiet, except for our footsteps on the leaf litter. The kids stayed unusually close to me, not running ahead or lagging behind like they normally would. We were about 100 yards from the truck when the smell hit us. If you've ever smelled a dead animal that's been lying in the summer heat for days, imagine that, but worse, much worse. It was decay and rot, but mixed with something musky and animal-like. The stench was so powerful, it made my eyes water. "Oh God, what is that?" Tyler gagged, pulling his collar up over his nose. "Something dead," I said, but I knew that wasn't quite right. This smell seemed fresh, active, not just the passive odor of decomposition. The closer we got to the truck, the stronger the smell became. By the time we reached the edge of the woods, it was almost unbearable. I hurried the kids the final 50 yards to the truck, unlocked it, and got them inside. Only when we were safely in the vehicle with the windows up did I feel like I could breathe again. As I started the engine, Emma suddenly spoke up. "Dad, did you see that thing in the tree?" My blood ran cold. "What thing, honey?" Tyler and Emma exchanged glances. "When you were looking at the deer blood," Tyler said, "we both saw something climbing a tree. It was big and black and hairy." "Like a bear?" I asked, though I knew there hadn't been bears in that part of Illinois for 100 years. Both kids shook their heads. "It wasn't a bear," Emma insisted. "It had arms and legs like a person, but it was covered in black hair. It went up that big oak tree really fast." "Yeah," Tyler added, "but it didn't have a neck. Its head just kind of sat on its shoulders, and it was watching us, Dad. I know it was." I felt sick. My kids had never shown any interest in Bigfoot or Sasquatch. We didn't watch those kinds of shows or talk about that stuff. Yet here they were, independently describing something that sounded exactly like the classic descriptions I'd heard. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady as I drove us away from the area. "I thought you'd think I was making it up," Tyler admitted. "And it happened really fast," Emma added. "By the time I wanted to say something, it was gone." I drove home in silence, my mind racing. The knocking sounds. I'd later learn that tree knocking is commonly associated with Sasquatch encounters. The powerful movement through the brush, whatever it was, had strength beyond a normal animal. The horrific smell that seemed to follow us to the truck. And finally, my children's sighting of something they shouldn't have known how to describe. I've replayed that day 1,000 times in my head. Could it have been a bear, despite what the wildlife officials claim about their absence in the area? Could the kids have seen a large black cat or some other animal and misinterpreted it? Was the knocking just another hunter using a grunt call or rattling antlers? Maybe. But none of those explanations account for everything we experienced. We went back to those woods twice more that season, but never to that specific area. Something about it felt marked, claimed, like we'd been warned away. The following spring, I returned alone to the spot where we'd abandoned the blood trail. I told myself I was looking for antler sheds, but really, I wanted to see if I could make sense of what happened. The forest seemed normal that day, birds singing, squirrels chattering, no strange smells or sounds. But I found something that still gives me chills when I think about it. About 20 yards from where we'd turned around, I found the remains of the buck Tyler had shot. Just bones and bits of hide, which isn't unusual after a winter. But the carcass wasn't scattered by coyotes or other scavengers as you'd normally see. The skeleton was largely intact, and the strangest part, it had been deliberately placed in a small clearing, the bones arranged in a way that didn't look natural at all. I left immediately and haven't been back to that specific part of the woods since. The kids are grown now, but they still remember that day clearly. Tyler refuses to hunt in that area, and Emma says she still has nightmares about the thing in the tree. I'm not saying we encountered a Bigfoot or Sasquatch that day. I'm just saying I experienced something I cannot explain, something that doesn't fit with the natural world as I understand it. Whatever it was, it seemed intelligent, powerful, and deliberately warning us away from its territory. Sometimes when I'm alone in the woods now, I find myself listening for that distinctive knocking sound, and part of me hopes I never hear it again. Story 7. I've been a park ranger at Thunder Creek for 7 years now. I know these woods like the back of my hand. Every trail, every landmark, every sound the forest makes. At least I thought I did until last Thursday. The morning started like any other patrol day. I woke up at 4:30, made some coffee, packed my lunch, and headed out before sunrise. It was unusually cold for October, probably around 35 degrees. And there was this dense fog hanging low over everything. The kind of morning where your breath makes these little clouds that hang in the air. I'd been getting reports from hikers about strange noises and activity near the creek bed in the north section. Most times, these reports are nothing, just city folks getting spooked by normal forest sounds or maybe catching a glimpse of a deer. Part of my job is checking these things out, even when I'm pretty sure it's nothing. The north section is pretty isolated. Not many visitors go there because the trails aren't maintained as well, and it's a good 4-mile hike from the nearest parking area. I parked my truck at the service road access point and hiked in. The fog was still thick at 7 in the morning, making everything look different, almost otherworldly. The trees were just black silhouettes, and visibility was maybe 50 feet at best. I'd been walking for about an hour, taking my time, listening. The forest was unusually quiet. Normally, even in cold weather, you hear birds, squirrels, the rustle of small animals. But that morning, nothing. Just the sound of my boots on the frozen ground and my own breathing. Looking back, that should have been my first clue that something wasn't right. I made it to the creek bed around 8:15. The water was low this time of year, exposing more of the rocky creek bed than usual. I noticed some unusual tracks in the mud near the water's edge. Wide, deep impressions that didn't match any animal I was familiar with. They weren't clear enough to make out details, just depressions really, like something heavy had walked there. I took some photos with my phone and was making notes when I heard it. Movement in the underbrush about 30 yards to my right. Not small movement, but something large, pushing through the brush. My first thought was bear. We get black bears in the area, and they're usually moving around a lot in fall, storing up fat for winter. I immediately went still. 7 years of ranger training kicks in. You don't run from bears. I slowly moved my hand to my sidearm. I don't like using it, but when it comes to potentially aggressive wildlife, I need to be ready. The sound got closer, and I could tell by the way the brush was moving that whatever it was big, really big. The fog had started to lift a bit, but visibility was still poor. I strained to see through the trees, my heart pounding in my chest. And then it stepped out into a small clearing. I've spent my entire adult life in these woods. I've seen bears, moose, elk, mountain lions, all the large mammals native to this region. What stepped out wasn't any of those. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. It was walking upright on two legs. My first confused thought was that it was another hiker, maybe someone in a heavy coat. But no, this thing was massive, at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller. But it wasn't just the height that was impressive. Its shoulders were impossibly wide, giving it this appearance of extreme bulk. The width of its upper body must have been at least 4 feet across. Its body was covered in thick black fur, not the brown or cinnamon color of our local bears. And its head, God, its head was all wrong. Small, almost knobby looking, sitting directly on those massive shoulders without much of a neck. It looked disproportionate, like it belonged on a much smaller creature. I stood frozen, not daring to move. My hand was still on my gun, but I knew instinctively that it would be useless against something this size. The creature was about 20 yards away from me now, and I could see steam rising from its body in the cold air. Here's the thing that still haunts me. It knew I was there. I'm certain of it. But it didn't react the way a wild animal should. It didn't charge me like a territorial bear might. It didn't flee like a startled deer. It just acknowledged my presence with complete indifference. It turned slightly and began walking toward the edge of the forest, moving with this casual confidence that I can't really explain. Its gait was smooth, deliberate, not the lumbering movement of a bear on hind legs or the awkward stride of something not used to walking upright. This thing was completely comfortable on 2 legs. It never once turned to look directly at me. There was no curiosity, no fear, no aggression, just this dismissive awareness, like I was so insignificant it didn't even need to assess whether I was a threat. The whole encounter probably lasted 10 seconds at most, but it felt like time had stopped. As it reached the tree line at the edge of the small clearing, there was an overhanging branch, a thick one, probably 6 inches in diameter. Instead of ducking under it, the creature casually raised its left arm and swatted the branch aside. The strength required to do that so effortlessly, it was terrifying. Then it disappeared into the trees, climbing a small hill on the other side of the clearing. I heard it moving away for another 30 seconds or so, and then nothing. Complete silence again. I stood there for what must have been 5 minutes, unable to move. My legs felt like they were made of lead. My mouth was completely dry. When I finally managed to take a step, my legs were shaking so badly I nearly fell. I didn't follow it. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get the hell out of there. I'm not ashamed to admit I was terrified. I've faced down aggressive wildlife before, but this was different. This wasn't just an animal. There was an intelligence behind its movements, a purpose that I couldn't comprehend. I made it back to my truck in record time. I don't think my heart rate dropped below 100 the entire hike out. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like I was being watched, but I never saw it again. When I got back to the ranger station, I immediately reported the incident to my supervisor, Mike. He's been a ranger for 25 years and has seen just about everything these woods have to offer. But as I described what I'd seen, I watched his expression change from interest to skepticism. "Sounds like you saw a bear, Turner," he said after I finished. "Black bears stand up all the time. The fog probably made it look bigger than it was." "It wasn't a bear, Mike," I insisted. "I know what bears look like, even standing. This was walking upright naturally. And the way it moved that branch," he just shook his head. "Write up your report. I'll file it as a possible bear sighting." I wrote the report, but I knew nobody would take it seriously. The official record now shows a possible bear sighting in the north section. Nothing unusual, nothing worth investigating further. I've heard the local stories, of course. Every rural area has them. Tales of creatures in the woods, just beyond the reach of civilization. I always dismissed them as campfire stories, ways for locals to spook tourists and each other. But now, I'm not so sure. I've gone back to that section 3 times since the encounter, Each time I bring my personal camera, a good one with a telephoto lens, the department has trail cams, but getting authorization to place them in remote areas requires justification, and I saw Bigfoot isn't going to cut it with the higher-ups. The thing is, I don't think what I saw was what people call Bigfoot. The descriptions don't match. The head was all wrong, the proportions different. This was something else, something that walks these woods with complete confidence, something that knows this is its territory, not ours. I've been a rational person my whole life. I believe in what I can see, touch, and measure, but I also trust my own eyes and my own experience. What I saw was real. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a moose, it wasn't a person in a costume. It was something else, something that shouldn't exist according to science and reason, but exists nonetheless. The strangest part, I'm not afraid to go back into those woods. I'm cautious, yes, but also curious. That thing could have attacked me if it wanted to. It was clearly powerful enough to tear me apart without much effort. But it didn't. It didn't even seem interested, and that makes me wonder, how long has it been there? How many other people have seen it and stayed quiet, fearing ridicule? Are there more of them? I check the tracks I photographed almost daily, but wildlife experts I've consulted off the record just say they're inconclusive, probably bear tracks distorted by rain or thawing ground. But I know what I saw. Every time I'm on patrol now, especially in the northern section, I feel different about these woods. I thought I knew every living thing that called this place home. I was wrong. There's something else out there, something that walks the line between legend and reality. And it knows these woods better than I ever will. I haven't told anyone else about this, not my wife, not my friends, nobody, until now. I needed to put this in writing, to tell someone what happened. Because every day that passes, I question my own memory a little more. Did it really happen? Was it really that big? Did it move the way I remember? But then I close my eyes, and I can see it perfectly. That massive silhouette in the fog, those impossibly broad shoulders, that small, strange head. And I know it was real. I'll keep looking. One day, I'll get proof. And when I do, I won't be the crazy park ranger who saw something in the fog. I'll be the one who proved that Thunder Creek is home to something beyond our understanding, something that's probably been there long before us and will remain long after we're gone. Story 8. I've been holding this in for too long, and I need to share what happened to us. My husband Nathan thinks I should just forget about it, but I can't. Every time we go hiking now, I'm constantly looking over my shoulder. We've lived in the same house near the Ozark National Forest since 2013. It's beautiful here, peaceful, remote, just the way we like it. Nathan and I are both outdoorsy people, and taking our dog Ranger out for hikes has been our daily routine for years. We know these woods like the back of our hands, or at least we thought we did. Over the years, we'd occasionally hear weird stuff while hiking. Strange knocking sounds, like someone hitting a baseball bat against a tree. I remember the first time we heard it back in 2015 or so. We were pretty deep into the Crooked Creek trail system, and there were 3 distinct knocks that echoed through the trees. Nathan brushed it off as a woodpecker, but it sounded way too loud and deliberate. There was something about it that just felt intentional. We'd also sometimes come across trees that were twisted or snapped in ways that didn't make sense. Not just fallen trees from storms, but trees that looked like something had deliberately broken them at impossible angles. Nathan always had some explanation. That's just how trees grow sometimes, or maybe it was damaged in that ice storm last winter. I'd go along with it because honestly, what else could it be? For 7 years, these were just occasional weird things that happened in the woods, nothing that kept me up at night. But everything changed in September of 2020. It was a Tuesday evening, and we decided to take Ranger for his usual hike along the Crooked Creek Trail. The sun was starting to get low, but we had plenty of daylight left. The weather was perfect, not too hot, not too cold, just a typical early fall day in Arkansas. About a mile in, Ranger started acting strange. He's usually bouncing ahead of us, sniffing everything, but suddenly he was glued to Nathan's side, tail tucked. I asked Nathan if he thought Ranger might be sick, but before he could answer, we heard it. The sound still gives me chills when I think about it. It was a howl, but not like a wolf or coyote. It was deeper, more guttural, almost like a roar mixed with a howl. It echoed through the trees and seemed to come from the ridge about 200 yards to our right. Nathan froze mid-step. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. "I don't know," I said, feeling my heart race. "Maybe a bear? We've encountered black bears before, but they usually just run away. And this didn't sound like any bear I'd ever heard." Before we could decide what to do, we heard a second howl roar from the opposite direction. It was like the first sound was being answered. That's when I realized whatever made these sounds, there were at least two of them, and they were communicating. Nathan grabbed Ranger's leash tighter and said, "Let's get out of here." We hurried back down the trail, constantly looking over our shoulders. We didn't run. Nathan always says never to run in the woods if you encounter something dangerous, but we moved fast. The entire way back, I felt like we were being watched. When we got home, we tried to rationalize what we'd heard. Mountain lion? No, they screamed, not howl roar. Wolf? There aren't supposed to be wolves in this part of Arkansas. Bear? Maybe, but it didn't sound right. We spent the evening watching YouTube videos of different animal sounds, but nothing matched what we'd heard. For the next few days, we stuck to hiking in the more popular areas of the forest, where there were other people around. But curiosity got the better of us. The following weekend, we went back to Crooked Creek. I know, stupid, right? But we'd been hiking there for years without any problems, and part of me needed to prove that there was a logical explanation for what we'd heard. It was around 4 in the afternoon when we arrived. The trail was empty as usual. It's one of the less traveled paths in the forest. Everything seemed normal at first. Ranger was his usual self, darting around and sniffing everything. We hiked for about 40 minutes without incident, which honestly made me feel a bit silly for being so scared earlier. We came to a small stream crossing, and Ranger decided to stop for a drink and cool off. Nathan stayed with him while I walked a few steps ahead to take some photos of the way the light was filtering through the trees. That's when I saw it. I noticed movement on the ridge about 50 yards ahead of us. At first, I thought it was a deer, or maybe a black bear. I squinted, trying to get a better look through the brush. What I saw made my blood run cold. It was walking upright, on 2 legs, but it wasn't a person. The creature was massive, at least 6 feet tall, maybe taller. It was covered in what looked like black or very dark brown hair, not fur, but hair. I couldn't see its face clearly because of the distance and the brush, but I could tell it had a large, bulky frame. It wasn't thin like a person in a costume. It was broad, muscular. It moved with purpose, taking deliberate steps along the ridge. There was something so unsettlingly human-like about its movement, but also distinctly not human at the same time. It swung its arms as it walked, almost like a person would, but the proportions were all wrong. Its arms seemed too long, hanging lower than a human's would. I stood there, frozen in place, watching it move across the ridge. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. It was like my brain couldn't process what my eyes were seeing. Finally, I managed to call out, "Nathan!" My voice came out as a hoarse whisper. "What?" he called back, still by the stream with Ranger. I couldn't take my eyes off the creature as I said, louder this time, "Nathan, come here now." I heard him walking toward me, gravel crunching under his boots. "What's going on?" "Look," I said, pointing to the ridge. "Do you see that? On the ridge." By the time Nathan reached me and looked where I was pointing, the creature had disappeared over the other side of the ridge. "See what?" he asked, scanning the area. "There was something up there," I said, my voice shaking, "walking on 2 legs. It wasn't a bear, Nathan. It wasn't a person either." He put his arm around me. Are you sure it wasn't just a bear standing up? They do that sometimes. It was walking, Nathan. Bears don't walk on two legs for that long, and it didn't move like a bear. I was getting frustrated because I knew what I saw, and it wasn't anything I could explain. Ranger had followed Nathan and was now standing beside us, hackles raised, staring at the ridge and growling softly. That's when I knew I wasn't imagining things. Ranger sensed something too. "Let's go," Nathan said, clearly uneasy. "It's getting late anyway." On the way back to the car, I kept going over what I'd seen in my mind. I hadn't imagined it. It was real, and the more I thought about it, the more certain I became about what I had seen. Nathan tried to be supportive, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. He kept offering alternative explanations. Maybe it was a hiker in dark clothes. Maybe it was a bear that just looked like it was walking upright from my angle. But I know what I saw. For the next few months, we stopped hiking at Crooked Creek. We stuck to more populated trails, always making sure to finish our hikes well before sunset. But the experience haunted me. I started researching online, looking at reports of similar sightings in the Ozarks. There were more than I expected, stories of howls and wood knocks and glimpses of large, hair-covered creatures walking on two legs. Nathan thought I was becoming obsessed, and maybe I was, but I needed answers. I needed to know I wasn't crazy. In February of 2021, after months of sticking to safer trails, I convinced Nathan to go back to Crooked Creek. It was a cold, clear day. The leafless winter trees meant better visibility, which made me feel a little safer. I brought my phone, determined to capture any evidence if we encountered anything unusual. We were about 30 minutes into our hike when Ranger ran ahead to a cluster of trees just off the trail. I decided to film him playing, thinking it would make a cute video. I stood there for maybe a minute, phone in hand, watching Ranger sniff around the base of the trees. When we got home that evening, I was scrolling through the photos and videos I'd taken. When I played the video of Ranger by the trees, I nearly dropped my phone. There, clear as day on the audio, was a sharp, loud wood knock. It happened about 20 seconds into the video. The weird thing is, I hadn't heard it when I was filming. I was standing right there, and I didn't hear a thing. But on the video, it's unmistakable. A single, deliberate knock, like someone hitting a piece of wood against a tree. I played it for Nathan, and for the first time, he couldn't explain it away. He looked pale as he listened to it again and again. "That's not normal," he finally admitted. Since then, we've been back to Crooked Creek a handful of times, always in broad daylight, always together. We've heard the knocking. Sounds a few more times, always distant, always just one or two knocks. We've never again heard those terrifying howl roars, and I've never again seen the creature from the ridge. But I know it's out there. Whatever it is, it's been there all along, watching us as we hike through what we thought were just ordinary woods. Sometimes, when we're on the trail, I get that feeling again, like we're being observed from a distance. Nathan still tries to find logical explanations, but he's not as quick to dismiss my concerns anymore. Sometimes, when we're hiking and Ranger suddenly stops and stares into the dense brush, I see Nathan tense up too. I don't know what's out there in the Ozark National Forest. I don't know if it's what people call Bigfoot or Sasquatch or something else entirely. All I know is that something lives in those woods, something that knocks on trees and moves on two legs and makes sounds that don't belong to any known animal. And sometimes, when I'm alone and the house is quiet, I swear I can hear knocking in the distance, coming from the edge of the woods. Story 9. I've been debating whether to share this for weeks now, but I need to get it off my chest, and I figure this community might understand. This happened just a couple months ago, late October this year, 2023, and I still wake up in the middle of the night thinking about it. I've always been into solo camping and hiking, been doing it for years, but never had enough cash to get serious equipment. That changed in September when I found this older RV on Craigslist. Nothing fancy, just a 1998 Coachman that had seen better days. But the price was right, and the engine ran well. The previous owner had kept it in decent shape, and I figured it would be perfect for weekend getaways where I could have a bit more comfort than my usual tent setup. With winter approaching fast, I wanted to get in one good trip before the weather turned nasty. I took a Friday off work to make it a long weekend and decided to head into the Cascades. I'd been researching some lesser-known spots online and found mentions of this remote trailhead that wasn't really marked on the regular maps. Only reason I even knew about it was from some obscure hiking forum where people shared GPS coordinates of hidden gems. The drive out took longer than expected. The last 20 miles were on these narrow, winding Forest Service roads that hadn't been maintained in God knows how long. The RV handled it okay, but I had to go slow to avoid the worst potholes. Cell service disappeared about an hour before I reached the spot, which didn't bother me. The whole point was to disconnect for a few days. I finally found the unmarked turnoff around 4 in the afternoon. It was just this little gap between trees that you'd miss if you weren't specifically looking for it. The road was barely more than a dirt path, and I honestly wasn't sure if the RV would make it. But after about half a mile of careful driving, I reached a small clearing. It was perfect. This beautiful open space, maybe 50 yards across, surrounded by these massive old-growth trees, the kind that make you feel tiny when you stand beneath them. The ground was covered in pine needles, and there was this eerie silence that you only get when you're truly away from civilization. No distant traffic, no planes overhead, nothing but occasional bird calls and the sound of wind through the branches. I parked the RV facing out toward the clearing, backed up near the edge of the trees but not under them. The sun was already getting low, casting long shadows across the ground. The temperature was dropping fast, typical for late October in the mountains. I fired up the RV's heater, which made this concerning rattling noise, but eventually kicked in properly. After setting up my little camp chair outside and getting a small fire going in one of those portable fire pits, I heated up some chili on my camp stove and just sat there enjoying the quiet. The stars were starting to come out, so many more than you can see in the city. It was exactly what I needed after months of stress at work. Around 7, I decided to explore a bit before it got completely dark. I grabbed my headlamp and walked along the edge of the clearing, finding what looked like a game trail heading into the woods. I only went maybe a quarter mile in before turning back. Something about those woods felt unwelcoming. That sounds dramatic, but that's the only way I can describe it. Just this sense that I shouldn't go further as daylight faded. By 8, I was back in the RV with the doors locked, reading a book on my Kindle and occasionally glancing out the windows at the darkness. The night was completely still. No wind at all. It was actually a bit unnerving how quiet it had gotten. Even the nocturnal wildlife seemed absent. I turned in around 10, crawling into the surprisingly comfortable bed in the back of the RV. I remember thinking how nice it was to be in a warm bed instead of a sleeping bag on the ground. I drifted off easily, exhausted from the drive and fresh air. And then I woke up. My phone said it was 12:14 a.m. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. The RV was dark except for the tiny green light on the smoke detector. I lay there disoriented when I heard it. Scratch, slow and deliberate, like a fingernail being dragged across the metal exterior of the RV. My first thought was that a branch must be scraping against the side. But there was no wind, and I hadn't parked under any trees. I stayed perfectly still, straining to listen. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It was moving, slowly circling around the RV, not continuous, but in these methodical, spaced-out drags, like someone or something was running their hand along the side as they walked around. I could track the progress of the sound as it moved from the driver's side, across the front, and then along the passenger side where my bed was located. When the scratching reached the wall right next to my head, it stopped. I was holding my breath, my heart pounding so hard I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. For maybe 30 seconds, there was nothing. Then it started again, continuing its circuit around to the back of the RV. I wanted to believe it was an animal, a bear maybe, or even a mountain lion. But bears don't circle prey like that. And it didn't sound like claws. It sounded like fingers, thick, heavy fingers dragging deliberately across the metal. The scratching completed a full circuit and then started again. This time, when it reached the back door of the RV, it stopped, and then tap, just once, light, almost tentative. Then again, tap, tap. The tapping grew gradually more insistent. Tap, 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 until it wasn't tapping anymore but knocking. Sharp, distinct knocks that made the thin walls of the RV vibrate slightly. Not frantic but methodical, testing, like it was checking the strength of the door. I was completely paralyzed. I had this sleeping bag pulled up to my chin, and I couldn't have moved if my life depended on it. My mind was racing through options. The RV keys were in the front. I had a small knife in my backpack across the cabin. My phone had no service. But mostly, I was trying to convince myself this was just an animal, despite knowing deep down that no animal behaves this way. The knocking continued for what felt like forever, but was probably only a minute or two. Then it stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the knocking. At least with the knocking, I knew where it was. Now, I was straining to hear any indication of where it had gone. That's when the rocking started. At first, it was subtle, just a slight shift in the RV's balance. Then it became unmistakable. Something was pushing against the side of the vehicle, causing it to rock gently from side to side. Not violently, not like it was trying to tip it over, but with this careful, measured pressure, testing it. The whole RV creaked and groaned under the strain, the suspension squeaking rhythmically. Whatever was doing this had to be incredibly strong. This wasn't a person. No single human could rock a 3,000-pound vehicle like that. The pressure would ease off, then return from a different angle, like it was systematically checking every point of structural weakness. I had this horrible image in my head of the roof suddenly peeling open like a sardine can. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get to the driver's seat and just floor it. But I was convinced that any movement would somehow make it worse. Like maybe as long as I stayed perfectly still, whatever was out there might lose interest. The rocking continued for what my phone later told me was about 17 minutes, though it felt like hours. It never became violent, just this persistent rhythmic testing. The worst part was not knowing what would happen next. Would it escalate? Would it find a way in? Or was this just some kind of bizarre territorial display? And then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The RV settled back on its suspension with a final creak. I lay there, rigid with fear, waiting for the next development. But there was nothing. No scratching, no knocking, no rocking. Just the absolute silence of the forest at night. I stayed frozen in that position until the first hint of dawn started to lighten the windows. I didn't sleep. I didn't even close my eyes. Every tiny sound, the refrigerator cycling on, the metal contracting as the temperature dropped, made me flinch. When it was finally light enough to see clearly outside, I forced myself to get up. My muscles were stiff from being tensed all night. I peered cautiously out each window before unlocking the door. The clearing looked exactly as it had the day before, peaceful, empty, innocent in the morning light. Except for one thing. The RV wasn't where I had parked it. It had been moved, shifted about a foot to the left of where I'd originally stopped. I know this because I had lined up the door with this distinctive fallen log as a step when I first parked. Now the RV was clearly offset from that log. I circled the vehicle, inspecting every inch of the exterior. There were no scratches, no marks, nothing to indicate what had touched it. The ground around the RV showed no footprints or tracks of any kind, just undisturbed pine needles and dirt. I was packed and driving away within 15 minutes. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the key in the ignition. I didn't make coffee, didn't eat breakfast, didn't even brush my teeth. I just needed to get the hell out of there. As I navigated back down that narrow trail to the Forest Service road, I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see something emerge from the trees. But there was nothing, just the dark line of the forest receding behind me. I've spent weeks trying to rationalize what happened. Maybe it was bears. Maybe it was some local messing with me, though how they found me in such a remote spot is beyond me. Maybe the RV shifted on its own due to settling ground. None of these explanations feel right. What kind of animal scratches in a perfect circle? What kind of person is strong enough to rock an RV? And why was there no evidence left behind? I've sold the RV since then, lost money on it, but I couldn't stand looking at it in my driveway, much less imagine sleeping in it again. I still go hiking, but not alone, and never in that part of the Cascades. I don't know what was out there that night. I don't know what it wanted or why it left without getting in. All I know is that something tested my shelter methodically and intelligently, and then somehow moved a 3,000-pound vehicle without leaving a single trace. And sometimes, when I'm drifting off to sleep, I still hear that sound. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Story 10. I still can't believe what happened to me last summer. I've been trying to make sense of it for months, but I honestly don't know if I ever will. I've always loved the outdoors, fishing, hiking, camping, but now I'm not so sure anymore. I'm 17, and I've been fishing since I was old enough to hold a rod. My family has a cabin near the Chequamegon-Nicolet Forest in northern Wisconsin, and I've spent every summer there since I was a kid. I know those woods like the back of my hand, or at least I thought I did. That day started like any other. It was mid-July, hot but not unbearable, with that kind of perfect summer sky that makes you glad to be alive. I packed my tackle box, grabbed my favorite rod, and headed out to this secluded spot on the river I'd found a couple years back. It's about a 2-mile hike from our cabin, but worth it because nobody else ever fishes there, and the trout are always biting. I remember checking my phone before I lost signal. It was around 1 in the afternoon when I reached my spot. The river was running clear and cool, birds were singing, insects buzzing, just a perfect peaceful day in the woods. I set up my gear on this flat rock that juts out a bit into the water, baited my hook, and cast my line. For about an hour, everything was normal. I caught 2 decent-sized trout, released them, wasn't planning to keep any that day, and was just enjoying the solitude. There's something about being alone in nature that recharges me, you know? At least, that's how I used to feel. The first thing that changed was the splash. Not like a fish jumping or a branch falling in the water. This was like someone had dropped a freaking boulder into the river maybe 50 yards downstream from me. The sound echoed through the trees, and water splashed up at least 3 feet high. I remember thinking it was weird because the bank is pretty steep there, and it would be hard for someone to roll a rock that size down to the water. I stood up, squinting downstream, thinking maybe some hikers were messing around. That's when I saw it. On the opposite bank, partially hidden behind a cluster of pine trees, was something. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it. A bear, maybe. But bears don't stand like that. This thing was upright, massive, with these incredibly long arms that hung down almost to its knees. Its chest was wide, way wider than any human's, and its head looked too big for its body, kind of pushed forward on its shoulders. But the worst part, it was staring right at me. I could feel its eyes locked on mine from across the river, and I swear to God, everything in my body just froze. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even think straight. It was like my brain short-circuited trying to process what I was seeing. I'm not small, I'm 6'1" and play football, but this thing made me feel tiny. Based on the trees it was standing near, it had to be at least 10 or 11 feet tall. And it wasn't thin either. This was a massive, bulky creature, covered in what looked like dark brown or black hair. We stared at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds. Then it moved, not away from me, but at an angle that was bringing it closer to my side of the river. Each step it took made this horrible crunching sound as branches snapped and leaves crushed under its weight. I could actually feel tiny vibrations in the ground when it stepped. And then the weirdest thing happened. Everything went silent. I mean completely, unnaturally silent. No birds chirping, no insects buzzing, no leaves rustling. It was like someone had hit mute on the entire forest. I've been in those woods hundreds of times, and I've never experienced anything like that silence. It was wrong, like the whole forest was holding its breath. That's when I snapped out of my frozen state. I started grabbing my gear as quietly as possible, shoving stuff into my backpack with shaking hands. I didn't want to make any sudden movements or noise, but I also knew I needed to get the hell out of there. I kept glancing up, and the thing was still moving, still watching me as it walked. "Hey!" I finally called out, my voice cracking embarrassingly. "Who's there?" Part of me was desperately hoping it was just some guy in a costume, some elaborate prank. But deep down, I knew better. No response, just those heavy footsteps and that awful silence. I shouldered my backpack and started walking, not running yet, because I was afraid running might trigger something, like with predatory animals. I headed back toward the trail that would take me to the road, about 2 miles away. The whole time, I kept looking over my shoulder, but I couldn't see the creature anymore through the trees. After about 10 minutes of walking as fast as I could without actually running, I started to calm down a little. Maybe I had imagined it? Maybe it was just a bear that looked weird from that angle? I was trying to rationalize what I'd seen, but my gut knew better. The trail dips down into a small valley before climbing back up toward the road. As I started descending the hill, about a quarter mile from where my car was parked, that feeling hit me. You know that feeling when you know someone is watching you. It's like this pressure on the back of your neck, this certainty that there are eyes on you. I felt that so strongly it actually made me stop walking. Slowly, I turned around, scanning the trees behind me. At first I didn't see anything, then movement caught my eye. About 100 yards back, there was an old barbed wire fence that separated 2 sections of the forest. As I watched, this massive dark figure literally leaped over that fence in a single bound. The fence had to be at least 5 feet high, and this thing cleared it like it was nothing. Then it started running, not toward me, but up a nearby hill. I've never seen anything move that fast through dense forest. It was dodging trees, leaping over fallen logs, moving with this terrible purpose and grace that something that size shouldn't have. As it ran, it passed this old tree stump probably 3 feet in diameter and bumped it with its leg. That stump shook like it had been hit by a car. It reached the top of the hill in seconds, and then it was gone, disappeared over the ridge. The whole sighting couldn't have lasted more than 10 or 15 seconds, but it's burned into my memory like a brand. I didn't stick around. I ran, full-out sprint all the way back to my car. I've never run so fast in my life, tripping over roots, scratching my arms on branches, not caring about anything except getting away. By the time I reached my car, I was hyperventilating, covered in sweat, hands shaking so badly I could barely get my keys out. I drove straight back to the cabin and burst through the door, probably looking like I'd seen a ghost. My aunt was there with my younger brother and cousin, and they all jumped when I slammed the door behind me. "What happened to you?" my aunt asked, and I just collapsed into a chair, trying to catch my breath. I didn't tell them what I'd seen, not right away. I was afraid they'd think I was crazy or making it up. I just said I got spooked in the woods and needed to catch my breath. But here's the thing that still gives me chills. Later that evening, my aunt mentioned that while I was gone, she, my brother, and my cousin had been sitting on the back porch when they heard something heavy moving through the brush behind the cabin. They thought it might be a deer or maybe a bear, but then they heard this deep, low growl that didn't sound like any animal they recognized. Whatever it was moved away after a few minutes, but it freaked them out enough that they went inside and locked the doors. This happened about an hour after my encounter, and our cabin is roughly 3 miles from where I was fishing. Could it have followed me? Was it the same thing? I ended up telling them what I saw that night. My aunt listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she didn't laugh or dismiss it. Instead, she told me that there have been stories about a creature like that in those woods for generations. The local Native American tribes have legends about it, and even some of the old-timers in town claim to have seen something similar over the years. We left the cabin 2 days early. I couldn't bear to stay there any longer, couldn't sleep without having nightmares about that thing finding me, watching me through my bedroom window with those eyes. It's been 7 months, and I still haven't been back to those woods. My parents want to go up to the cabin for spring break, but I've made up excuses not to go. How can I explain that the place that was like a second home to me now fills me with absolute dread? I used to feel so comfortable in the wilderness, like I belonged there. Now I feel like an intruder, like I've glimpsed something that humans aren't supposed to see, something that's been there all along, watching us from the shadows while we naively enjoy nature. I don't know what I saw that day. A Bigfoot? Some undiscovered species? A creature from another dimension? I don't have the answers. All I know is that it was real, it was intelligent, and it changed me forever. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, convinced that I can hear those heavy footsteps outside my window, that unnatural silence falling over the world. The worst part is not knowing if our paths will ever cross again. Because one thing was clear from the way it moved, the way it watched me. It wasn't afraid of me at all. And that's what terrifies me most of all. Story 11. I never thought I'd be the one writing something like this. I'm not some Bigfoot enthusiast or one of those people who believes in cryptids and whatnot. I've always been a skeptic, actually. But what happened to me in the Allegheny National Forest back in June of 2010 completely changed my perspective on what's real and what isn't. I still get goosebumps thinking about it. It was the second week of June, and my buddy Jeff and I had been planning this ATV trip for months. We'd been looking forward to riding the Timberline Trail near Marianville. The weather was perfect, not too hot, clear skies, just an ideal day to be out in the woods. We got an early start that morning, loaded up our quads on the trailer, and headed out around 7. The drive to Allegheny took about 2 hours, and we were both pumped, talking about which sections of the trail we wanted to hit. We'd heard about some awesome mud pits and technical sections that were supposed to be a blast. We got to the trailhead around 9:30, unloaded our ATVs, put on our gear, and hit the trail by 10. The forest was incredibly beautiful that day. Everything was green, the sun was filtering through the trees, and the trail was in great condition. We'd had some rain earlier that week, so there were some nice muddy sections that made for fun riding. Jeff and I had different riding styles. He likes to take it slow, enjoy the scenery, while I'm more about the speed and thrill. So naturally, I started pulling ahead of him. We had our walkie-talkies, so I told him I'd wait up at the next junction. The trail was well marked, and we'd both studied the map beforehand. After about an hour of riding, I came to this fork in the trail. There was a small clearing there, perfect spot to take a break. I was pretty sweaty at this point. It was getting warmer, probably mid-70s, and I'd been working the quad pretty hard through some technical sections. I pulled over, killed the engine, and just sat there for a minute, enjoying the quiet. It's funny how loud the forest gets when the ATV goes silent. Birds, insects, the wind in the trees. I figured Jeff was still a ways behind me, so I decided to cool off. I got off the quad, took my helmet off, and pulled my shirt off to let the breeze dry my sweat. It felt great just standing there in the sunshine, taking in the forest. I remember thinking how peaceful it was, how disconnected from everything. That's when it happened. I heard this small sound, like a tiny plink against my quad. I looked down, and saw a pebble roll off my front tire. At first I thought nothing of it. Maybe it fell from somewhere, or a bird kicked it up. But then another one hit the exact same spot on my tire, then another and another. 4 pebbles, all hitting the same spot on my tire, one after the other. This wasn't random. Someone, or something, was throwing them. I caught the 5th one mid-air. It was just a small stone, nothing special about it. But the precision of those throws, hitting the same spot over and over, that wasn't natural. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up as I scanned the woods around me. That's when I spotted it. About 100 yards away, partially hidden in some rhododendron bushes, something dark was moving. At first I thought maybe it was a bear. We're trained to deal with bears in these woods. Make yourself big, make noise, back away slowly. But as I stared, I realized this was no bear. The thing moved, stepping slightly out from behind the foliage, and I froze. My mind couldn't process what I was seeing. It was standing upright, on 2 legs. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, maybe more. And it was looking right at me. A Bigfoot, a fucking Bigfoot. Standing there real as day, watching me. I'd never believed in Bigfoot, ever. I'd always laughed at the shows, the blurry photos, the wild stories. But in that moment, all my disbelief vanished. This thing was real, and it was 30 yards away from me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. We just stared at each other. I can't tell you exactly how long, maybe 10 or 15 seconds, but it felt like forever. I was taking in every detail, almost like my brain was photographing it because it knew no one would believe me. It was completely black, not brown, not dark gray, but black. The hair on its body looked tight, not shaggy like you see in the movies. Its shoulders were enormous, like a professional football player. The muscles in its chest and arms were visible even under the hair. This thing was powerful. I could see its hands with long fingers moving slightly at its sides. Its face is what got me the most. This wasn't some animal. There was intelligence there. I could see its eyes, dark, almost hidden under a heavy brow. Its nose was flat and wide, and its lips were visible. It had this expression that wasn't quite curiosity and wasn't quite threat, more like assessment, like it was deciding what to do about me. Then, without taking its eyes off me, it took 3 steps backward, deliberate steps. And then it was just gone. It disappeared into the trees so fast and so completely that if I hadn't just been staring at it, I would have thought I imagined the whole thing. I stood there for maybe another 5 seconds before my survival instinct kicked in. I didn't bother putting my shirt back on. I just grabbed it, jammed my helmet on my head, and got on my quad as fast as I could. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely turn the key. The engine roared to life, and I took off down the trail, away from that thing, as fast as the ATV would go. I was terrified. Every shadow in the trees looked like it could be that creature. Every sound behind me made me think it was coming after me. I kept picturing those huge hands reaching out from the trees, grabbing me off my quad, dragging me into the forest. I've never ridden so recklessly in my life, hitting bumps at full speed, almost losing control on corners. I didn't care. I just needed to get away. After about 15 minutes of flat-out riding, I came around a bend and saw a group of other riders stopped at a mud pit. 3 guys and 2 women on ATVs, laughing and covered in mud as they tried to navigate the deep section. I've never been so happy to see strangers in my life. I pulled up and tried to act normal, but I must have looked a mess. No shirt, pale as a ghost, probably wild-eyed. They asked if I was okay, and I mumbled something about getting too hot and taking a spill. I pretended to be interested in their mud riding, watching them take turns going through the pit, but really I was just desperate to be around other people. Safety in numbers, you know? I kept checking my walkie-talkie, trying to reach Jeff. After about 20 minutes, his voice crackled through, asking where I was. I gave him directions to the mud pit, trying to keep my voice steady. Part of me was worried that thing had found him instead of me. When Jeff finally showed up, he was all smiles, talking about the awesome trail sections he'd ridden. He asked why I wasn't at the fork where I said I'd wait. I made up some excuse about getting bored and riding ahead. I couldn't tell him, not then. I couldn't even process it myself, let alone explain it to someone else. We rode the rest of the day with those other folks. I stayed in the middle of the pack, never on the edges. Every time we stopped, I scanned the tree line. Every noise in the woods made me jump. Jeff noticed something was off and kept asking if I was all right. I blamed it on being tired or the heat. The drive home was quiet. Jeff tried to talk about the ride, but I couldn't focus on the conversation. I kept seeing those dark eyes, those massive shoulders, those long fingers. I kept feeling the weight of that stare. I kept wondering why it threw those pebbles. Was it trying to get my attention? Was it warning me, testing me? I'll never know. I didn't tell Jeff about what happened until the next summer. He didn't believe me at first, just like I wouldn't have believed anyone who told me such a story before that day. But he could tell by the look in my eyes that I wasn't making it up. I've never gone back to that section of the Allegheny. I still ride ATVs, but never alone, and never in dense forest like that. Some people get excited about the idea of seeing a Bigfoot. Not me. There was something primal and terrifying about being watched by something that shouldn't exist, something that could have easily overpowered me if it wanted to. I don't know why it let me go. I don't know why it revealed itself to me in the first place. All I know is that it was real and it was intelligent, and it changed everything I thought I knew about what's out there in the woods. Sometimes at night, I still hear that sound, the small plink of a pebble hitting metal, and I wake up in a cold sweat, feeling those eyes on me again. Story 12. I've been sitting on this for over 20 years now, and I still can't explain what the hell I saw that night. I've gone back and forth about whether to share this, but I need to get it off my chest, and maybe someone here has seen something similar. This happened in November 2002. I was working as a nurse at the hospital in Marquette, Michigan back then. The Upper Peninsula isn't exactly a bustling metropolis, mostly forests, lakes, and small communities. Beautiful place, but isolated, especially in winter. That night, I just finished a brutal 12-hour shift. It was one of those shifts where everything goes wrong. 2 codes, short-staffed, and a patient who kept trying to pull out their IV. By the time I clocked out, I was completely drained. It was around 10:30 at night, pitch black outside, and I just wanted to get home. The drive from Marquette to my place took about 35 minutes on a good day. I lived in a small cabin-style house off Road 550, northwest of town. Anyone familiar with the UP knows this road. It winds along Lake Superior with dense forest on both sides, massive rock formations, and these eerie, boggy areas. During the day, it's stunning. At night, it's like driving through a tunnel of darkness. I'd been making this drive for 3 years by then, so I knew every curve and dip. The road is notorious for deer, so I was always on high alert, especially after dark. My headlights only carved out maybe 50 feet ahead of me, and beyond that was just blackness. The temperature that night was probably in the low 30s, not full winter yet, but cold enough that I had the heat blasting in my old Subaru. I remember I was listening to some late-night radio show to keep myself awake. My mind was half on the road and half on decompressing from work. There wasn't another car in sight, not unusual for that time of night in that area. I was approaching the section near Sugarloaf Mountain. Locals know it as a popular hiking spot. Wetmore Pond sits on the opposite side of the road. This stretch always made me a bit nervous because it's where the road gets particularly winding, and the forest presses right up against the guardrails. That's when I saw it. At first, my brain registered it as large animal crossing, the way your mind automatically categorizes things. But within a split second, I realized this was something completely different. About 100 feet ahead of me, this thing was crossing the road from left to right. It moved in these long, fluid strides that were nothing like a human's gait. It was covered head to toe in this brownish-red fur, not patchy like a mangy bear, but a full coat. The color reminded me of rusted metal or dried blood under my headlights. The proportions were all wrong. Its arms hung way too long, almost to its knees, and its legs were elongated in a way that made its movements look unnaturally smooth. It crossed the entire width of the road in maybe 3 or 4 strides. I immediately hit the brakes, not slamming them but firmly slowing down. My heart felt like it stopped. I remember my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white. The creature didn't acknowledge me at all, didn't look toward my headlights or hesitate. It had this terrifying sense of purpose, like it was completely focused on wherever it was going. When it reached the guardrail on the right side of the road, it paused for just a moment. That's when I got the clearest look at it. It stood upright, perfectly balanced on 2 legs. I'm guessing it was around 7 feet tall, but surprisingly slender for its height. Not skinny exactly, but lean. Powerfully built, but not bulky like a bear. Its head was somewhat pointed at the top, and though I couldn't make out facial features clearly, I had the distinct impression it had a snout, not a flat face like a human. Then it did something that still haunts me. It placed one hand on the guardrail and vaulted over it in a single fluid motion, like an Olympic hurdler, but with this eerie grace that nothing that size should possess. It disappeared down the embankment toward Wetmore Pond. The whole encounter lasted maybe 5 or 6 seconds. I didn't stop. I didn't turn around. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get out of there. I accelerated back up to speed and kept driving, checking my rearview mirror obsessively, half expecting to see it bounding after my car. My mind raced through possibilities. A bear? Absolutely not. I've seen plenty of bears in the UP, and they don't move like that. Even when they briefly stand on 2 legs, they're awkward and top-heavy. This thing was upright the entire time, moving with intention and balance. A person in a costume. At 10:30 at night, in November, in one of the most isolated stretches of road in the area. And no costume could mimic that fluid movement or that height. By the time I got home, I was shaking so badly I could barely get my key in the lock. I double-checked every window and door before I could even think about sitting down. I didn't sleep that night. Every noise outside my house made me jump. The next day, I almost convinced myself I'd hallucinated the whole thing from exhaustion. I even called in sick to work because I was so rattled. Part of me wanted to drive back to that spot in daylight to look for tracks or some kind of evidence, but another part of me was terrified of finding proof that what I saw was real. I did end up mentioning it to a co-worker a few days later, just vaguely, saying I thought I saw something weird on Road 550. She immediately asked, "Was it that Bigfoot thing people talk about?" I was shocked. Apparently there had been other sightings in that general area over the years, though most people kept quiet about them because, well, who wants to be the crazy person claiming they saw a monster? The locals have different names for it. Some call it the Michigan Dogman, others say it's some kind of forest guardian. A few old-timers from the Ojibwe community refer to a creature from their traditions that protects certain places in the wilderness. But nobody talks about these things openly. It's all whispered stories and friend-of-a-friend accounts. What bothers me most, even now, is how casual the encounter was. This wasn't some dramatic standoff or attack. The creature was simply existing, going about its business, like it had every right to be there, and I was the intruder. That sense of it belonging to that landscape in a way I never could disturbs me more than if it had acted aggressively. I still drive that road sometimes. You can't really avoid it if you live in that area, but I never drive it at night anymore if I can help it. If I have a late shift, I stay with a friend in town. I keep my high beams on and my eyes fixed straight ahead, afraid of what I might glimpse in my peripheral vision. What was it? I still don't know. The rational part of me wants to believe there's some logical explanation, some known animal seen from a weird angle or a trick of light and shadow, but the rest of me knows what I saw. Something that shouldn't exist in the world as I understand it. Something that makes me question everything I thought I knew about the wilderness around us. The forests in the UP are vast and ancient. There are swaths of land where people rarely set foot. Is it so impossible that something could live there, undetected by science? Something that's learned to avoid humans, venturing out only in the darkest hours. I've never seen it again, but I feel its presence every time I drive that road. Sometimes I catch myself scanning the tree line, half hoping and half terrified of spotting that distinctive silhouette. When I hike, I'm hyper-aware of sounds in the underbrush, of the feeling of being watched. The worst part is the uncertainty. If I'd gotten a clearer look, or if it had done something more dramatic, maybe I could have processed it better. But instead, I'm left with this brief, surreal moment that doesn't fit into any box. Was it a known cryptid? Some undiscovered species? Something paranormal? I don't have those answers. What I do know is that the Michigan wilderness holds secrets. That stretch of Road 550 between Marquette and Big Bay, with Lake Superior on one side and dense forest on the other, feels like a boundary between worlds sometimes, especially at night when the only light comes from your headlights and the stars above, and the darkness seems to press in from all sides. If you're ever driving that road late at night, keep your eyes on the pavement. Don't look too closely at the shapes moving between the trees. And if you see something tall and fur-covered step onto the asphalt ahead of you, don't stop. Just keep driving and hope it's not interested in you. Because whatever I saw that night is still out there, and some things are better left unencountered. Story 13. I still get goosebumps thinking about what happened that summer at Shawnigan Lake. It was 1973, and I was 15. My parents owned this little cabin that had been in our family for ages. Nothing fancy, just a wooden structure with a porch overlooking the water. Every summer, my cousins would come stay with us for a couple of weeks. That particular summer, all 5 of us girls were there. Me, my cousins Sarah and Jenny, who were 16, and the twins Lisa and Amy, who were 14. We were at that age where we thought we knew everything and adults knew nothing. My dad had these Marlboros he'd keep in his fishing vest, and I'd been sneaking them for about a year by then. I wasn't even really into smoking, honestly. It was more about the thrill of doing something forbidden. It was a Thursday evening in late July. The adults were all having drinks on the deck after dinner, getting louder with each beer. My Uncle Tom was telling the same fishing stories he always told, and the mums were gossiping about neighbors back home. We girls exchanged glances across the table, our silent communication perfected over years of summers together. "I'm tired," I announced, faking a yawn. "We're gonna go play cards in my room." My mom barely looked up. "Don't stay up too late." We slipped into my bedroom giggling, and I pulled the half-empty pack of Marlboros from under my mattress. "Ready?" I whispered. We climbed out the window rather than using the door. Again, not because we needed to, but because it felt more rebellious. The evening air was cool against my bare arms. I was wearing cut-off jean shorts and a t-shirt with a peace sign on it. I remember this because later I wished I'd worn something warmer, something with long sleeves. "Where are we going?" Amy asked, the youngest and always the most nervous. "I know a spot," I said. I'd been going to Shawnigan Lake my whole life and knew these woods like my own backyard. "There's this clearing down the old hunting trail. Dad showed me last summer when we were tracking deer." I led them down the path behind our cabin, into the trees. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the pines. The forest around Shawnigan Lake was dense, tall Douglas firs, western red cedars, the ground covered in sword ferns and salal bushes. The trail was narrow but clear, worn by decades of hunters. "How much farther?" Jenny complained after about 10 minutes of walking. "I'm getting eaten alive by mosquitoes." "Just a little more," I promised. "It's worth it. You can see the stars perfectly from the clearing." It was almost dark when we reached it. A small meadow, maybe 30 yards across, ringed by tall trees. The grass was still warm from the day's sun. We settled in the middle, sitting cross-legged in a circle. "Anybody ever smoked before?" I asked, knowing I was the only experienced one. The others shook their heads, trying to look cool but clearly nervous. I showed them how to light up, how to inhale without coughing, though they all did anyway. The ritual of it made me feel grown up, sophisticated. We must have been there for about 20 minutes, talking about boys from school and bands we liked when I first heard it. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving through the trees at the far edge of the clearing. But then I realized there wasn't any wind. The sound came again, a definite crashing like something big moving through the underbrush. "What was that?" Sarah asked, her voice suddenly small. "Probably just a deer," I said, trying to sound confident. But I knew deer didn't move like that. Deer were delicate, careful. This was heavy, deliberate. The crashing grew louder, branches breaking, undergrowth being pushed aside. Whatever it was big, and it was coming toward us from the north side of the clearing, the side furthest from the path back to the cabin. "Olivia?" Lisa's voice was trembling. "Is that a bear?" My heart started hammering in my chest. Bears weren't uncommon around Shawnigan Lake. My dad had taught me what to do if I ever encountered one. Make yourself look big, make noise, back away slowly. But all that knowledge evaporated in the face of actual fear. "Quick," I whispered, dropping my cigarette and grinding it out with my heel. "Behind that log." I pointed to a fallen cedar at the edge of the clearing, about 10 yards from where we sat. We scrambled over to it, ducking down behind its massive trunk. The log had been there for years, moss-covered, partially rotted, but big enough to hide all 5 of us if we crouched low. The crashing sounds grew closer, then suddenly stopped at the edge of the clearing. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise had been. I could hear my cousins breathing beside me, fast and shallow. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. And then the smell hit us. God, that smell. It's hard to describe if you've never experienced it, but I'll never forget it as long as I live. It was like a wet dog that had rolled in something dead, but with this strange chemical undertone that made my eyes water and my throat close up. It wasn't just strong, it was overwhelming, like it was filling up the clearing, seeping into our clothes, our hair, our skin. "What is that?" Amy whispered, and I shushed her, putting my finger to my lips. That's when I saw it step out from the trees. It emerged from the darkest part of the forest, where the pines grew so thick they blocked out what little daylight remained. At first, all I could make out was a shape, a darkness moving against the darkness, but as it moved into the clearing, I could see it more clearly in the fading twilight. It was tall, taller than any man I'd ever seen, 7 feet at least, maybe more. And it was walking upright on 2 legs, with a strange rolling gait. Its arms hung long at its sides, swinging slightly as it moved. The creature was covered in dark hair, not fur exactly, but more, like human hair, just longer and shaggier. In the dim light it looked dark brown or black. Its shoulders were massive, much broader than a person's, and its whole upper body seemed powerful, leaning slightly forward as it walked. Its head sat directly on those shoulders, with little visible neck. I couldn't make out its face clearly from that distance, maybe 60 yards away, but I had the impression of deep-set eyes beneath a prominent brow ridge. I'd heard stories about Sasquatch all my life. Growing up in British Columbia, they were as much a part of our folklore as thunderbirds or water babies were to the local First Nations people. But I'd always thought of them as just that, stories. Even as I watched this creature move across the far edge of the clearing, my mind kept trying to make it into something familiar. A bear walking on hind legs, a man in a costume, anything but what it appeared to be. The 5 of us were frozen behind that log, barely breathing. The creature moved with purpose, like it had somewhere to be. It didn't look around much, just kept its path along the tree line opposite us. I remember thinking that if it just kept going, if it didn't turn our way, We might be okay. That's when Jenny coughed. She tried to stifle it. I felt her body tense beside me as she fought it, but it came out anyway, a small, strangled sound in the stillness. The creature stopped instantly, its head turned toward us, and even from that distance I felt seen. It stood completely still for what felt like forever, but was probably only seconds. Then it took a step toward us. Amy started to whimper beside me. I grabbed her hand and squeezed it hard, willing her to be quiet. The creature took another step in our direction. Then, from back toward the cabin, we heard my dad's voice calling my name. "Olivia, girls, where are you?" The creature's head snapped toward the sound. Then, with a speed that seemed impossible for something so large, it turned and disappeared back into the trees. 3, maybe 4 strides, and it was gone. Just vanished into the forest like it had never been there at all. The only evidence it had existed was that lingering, awful smell. We didn't move for several seconds. Then, as if someone had fired a starting gun, we all scrambled to our feet and ran. We didn't speak, didn't look back, just ran full tilt down that hunting path toward the cabin, toward the lights and the adults and safety. We burst out of the trees and practically collided with my dad, who was standing at the edge of our property with a flashlight. "Where the hell have you been?" he demanded, his face a mix of anger and relief. "Your mother's been worried sick." We were all talking at once, breathless from running, but not saying anything about what we'd seen. Instead, we apologized for wandering off, made up some story about wanting to look at stars. My dad lectured us about going into the woods after dark, about bears and cougars and getting lost. The whole time, I was thinking how the thing we'd seen was far scarier than any bear or cougar. That night, the 5 of us crowded into my bedroom, none of us wanting to be alone. We whispered about what we'd seen, comparing details, making sure we hadn't imagined it. "Did you see how big it was?" Sarah kept saying. "Its arms were so long." "That smell," Lisa added. "I can still smell it on my clothes." We swore each other to secrecy. We knew if we told the adults, we'd have to admit to sneaking out to smoke, and besides, they wouldn't believe us anyway. They'd think we were making it up for attention, or that we'd seen a bear and let our imaginations run wild. For years afterward, we kept it to ourselves. But every summer when we returned to the lake, we'd talk about it again. The details never changed or faded. The smell, the size, the way it moved, the feeling of being seen by something that shouldn't exist. We'd compare notes, and our stories always matched up perfectly. I'm 58 now, and I've never gone back into those woods alone, not once in all these years. I still visit the lake house, but I stay close to the cabin, close to other people. My cousins are the same way. None of us can stand being in dense forest by ourselves anymore. I've researched Sasquatch sightings over the years, read accounts from all over the Pacific Northwest. Many of them describe exactly what we saw: the height, the gait, that distinctive smell. I know what people say, that it's all hoaxes and misidentifications. Maybe some of it is, but I know what I saw that night at Shawnigan Lake. All 5 of us know. That experience changed something fundamental in me. It made me realize the world is bigger and stranger than we can imagine, that there are things out there we don't understand. To this day, when I hear something moving in the woods, I freeze, and for just a moment, I'm 15 again, crouched behind that log, holding my breath, waiting for that smell to hit me. Story 14. I've been staring at this blank page for an hour now, trying to figure out how to even start. My hands still shake when I think about it. It's been almost 5 years, but some nights I still wake up in a cold sweat, thinking I hear those footsteps outside. This happened back in May of 2018. May 20th to be exact. It's burned into my memory. My son Ethan was 11 at the time. We own this piece of land out in central Oregon, about an hour off the main highway. Real beautiful spot, completely isolated with a clearing surrounded by dense forest and a steep ravine on one side. We'd go there maybe 3 or 4 times a year to camp, ride dirt bikes, and just disconnect from everything. That weekend was supposed to be special. Just me, my wife Laura, and Ethan. We'd been so busy with work and school that we hadn't had much family time. The weather forecast was perfect, and we'd packed up our camping gear, dirt bikes, and enough food for 3 days. We arrived around noon on Saturday and set up our tent near the edge of the clearing, maybe 50 yards from the tree line. It was a gorgeous day, blue skies around 70 degrees. The property has this little creek running through it that feeds into the ravine, and everything was extra green from the spring rains. After lunch, Ethan was eager to ride his dirt bike, so we geared up and spent a couple hours riding around the trails I'd cut through our property over the years. Around 3 in the afternoon, Ethan wanted to practice on the flat area near some old straw bales at the far edge of our clearing, so I told him to go ahead while I checked on Laura, who was reading by the tent. I was only with her for maybe 10 minutes when I heard Ethan's bike cut off suddenly. Then I saw him running toward us, moving way faster than his usual pace. Something was wrong. "Dad! Dad!" he was yelling, still wearing his helmet. "There's something over there, by the straw bales." I stood up, instantly on alert. "What do you mean? A bear?" We'd seen black bears in the area before, though they usually avoided the noise of the bikes. "No, no." He was breathing hard, his eyes wide. It was like a caveman or something. It was just sitting there watching me. Laura looked at me with concern, but I figured it was probably just a transient or maybe even another camper who'd wandered onto our property. We're pretty remote, but not impossible to reach. "I'll go check it out," I said, grabbing my phone and the small hatchet we use for firewood. "You stay here with Mom." Ethan grabbed my arm. "Dad, it wasn't a person, not like a normal person." The urgency in his voice made me pause. Ethan's not the type to make up stories or get easily spooked. He's always been level-headed, even as a kid. "What exactly did you see, buddy?" I asked. "It was big, really big. It was sitting down by the straw, but when it saw me looking, it stood up and walked toward the trees. It had hair all over it, like reddish-brown fur. And its face," he trailed off. "Its face looked weird." Laura put her arm around him. "Maybe it was just someone in hunting gear." "I know what hunting gear looks like, Mom," he said, annoyed at not being believed. I patted his shoulder. "I'll go look. You two stay here." It's about 150 yards from our campsite to the straw bales we keep for target practice. As I walked across the clearing, I kept scanning the tree line, half expecting to see a homeless person or hunter moving through the woods. When I got to the straw bales, I immediately saw where someone or something had been sitting. The top bale was compressed, and the ground in front had clear indentations. Whatever had been there was heavy. I scanned the surrounding area, and that's when I saw it. About 50 yards away, moving into the tree line at the edge of our property, was something. Even now, I struggled to find the right words. It was walking away from me, moving deliberately but not rushing. The first thing that struck me was the size. I'm 6'2", 230 pounds, and this thing made me feel small. It had to be at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller, and the build, Jesus, it was massive. Not fat, but solid, with shoulders that seemed almost twice as wide as mine. The entire back and arms were covered in long reddish-brown hair or fur. Not patchy like a mangy bear, but full coverage. Its right arm particularly caught my attention. It was swinging in this weird, deliberate motion as it walked, and the muscle definition was impossible to miss, even under the hair. The arm looked disproportionately massive compared to what you'd expect on a human. The thing that really froze me in place was its head. It sat low between these enormous shoulders, almost like there wasn't much of a neck, and it was larger than any human head I've ever seen. Not misshapen, just bigger. I stood there watching until it disappeared into the trees. My heart was pounding, and for a few seconds I couldn't move. I'm not someone who scares easily. I've encountered bears, cougars, all kinds of wildlife over the years, but this was different. This was something I couldn't classify. When I finally got my wits about me, I went back to Ethan and Laura. My son took one look at my face and knew. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked. I nodded. "What did you see of its face?" I asked him, trying to keep my voice calm. "Just the right side," he said. "It had skin, like light brown skin. Not hair on its face, and its eyes." He paused. They weren't like animal eyes. They looked almost human, but not quite. Everything about it seemed not quite right. Laura was looking between us, clearly unsure whether to be concerned or skeptical. Could it have been a bear walking on its hind legs? I shook my head. No way. It was bipedal, moving naturally on two legs, and the proportions were all wrong for a bear. We decided to investigate a bit more while it was still daylight. The three of us walked to the edge of the woods where I'd seen the thing disappear. That's where we found the tracks. Our property has this marshy area near the creek bed, and there in the soft ground were footprints. Not bear prints, not deer, not human either. At least not normal human. They were huge, wider than my size 13 boots by a good margin, with 5 distinct toes that looked human-like, but with a more rounded heel. We followed them for about 20 yards before they disappeared onto harder ground. Laura took some photos with her phone. We can't explain them. I've shown them to a buddy who works as a park ranger, and he couldn't identify them either. We debated whether to pack up and leave, but it was already late afternoon, and we'd have to drive an hour on dark forest roads to get back to the highway. I convinced Laura and Ethan that we'd be fine if we stayed close to camp, kept the fire going, and made noise. Looking back, that was a mistake. Around 5, I decided to take one more quick ride on my dirt bike to clear my head, staying on the main trails and away from the section where we'd seen the creature. I rode about half a mile from camp when I heard it. This high-pitched scream that didn't sound like any animal I've ever heard in those woods. It wasn't a cougar or coyote. It was almost like a person screaming, but with this weird vibrating quality that made the hair on my arm stand up. I immediately turned around and headed back to camp. We had a quiet dinner, all of us jumping at every sound from the forest. As it got dark, we built up the fire bigger than usual. Nobody mentioned what we'd seen, but it was all any of us could think about. We turned in around 10, all cramming into our 4-person tent. I kept the hatchet and a heavy flashlight within reach. Laura finally fell asleep around 11, but Ethan and I were still wide awake when we heard it. The neighbor's dog. We don't have close neighbors exactly, but there's a property about a mile away where this guy keeps a couple of hunting dogs. One of them started barking frantically, which wasn't unusual on its own. What was unusual was that the barking seemed to be moving, getting closer to our campsite through the woods. The dog kept barking for hours, the sound gradually approaching our camp. By around 3 in the morning, I estimated it was maybe a quarter mile away. Ethan was trembling beside me, and even Laura was awake now. I was about to get up and stoke the fire when we heard it. Something massive moving through the trees just outside our tent. Not trying to be stealthy at all. Breaking branches, heavy footfalls. The ground literally shook. Whatever it was bipedal. The rhythm of the steps made that clear. 2 feet, not 4. The dog, which had been barking non-stop, suddenly let out a single yelp, then complete silence. That silence was somehow worse than any noise could have been. We could hear breathing outside our tent. Deep, heavy breathing, like something with lungs twice the size of mine. It stayed there for what felt like forever, but was probably only a minute or 2. Then more footsteps, moving away from the tent toward the ravine side of our property. None of us slept after that. I sat by the fire with the hatchet until dawn, jumping at every sound. As soon as it was light enough, we packed up and left. We've never gone back to that spot to camp again. I've been up there a couple of times during daylight to check on the property, but always with friends, always armed, and never staying past afternoon. I've done research since then. Read about Bigfoot sightings, looked at supposed footprint casts. Some of them look eerily similar to what we saw, but I never believed in that stuff before, and part of me still doesn't want to. All I know for sure is what we saw wasn't human, wasn't a bear, wasn't anything I can explain. And whatever it was intelligent enough to follow that dog through the woods and silence it. Intelligent enough to approach our camp at night when we were vulnerable. Sometimes I still hear that silence after the dog's yelp in my dreams. And I wake up wondering what would have happened if that thing had decided to come into our tent that night. Story 15. I've never told many people about what happened that evening in 1967. It's not something I talk about casually. Even now, 50-some years later, I still get this hollow feeling in my stomach when I think about it. I was 7 years old then, living with my family on our farm in Davidson County, North Carolina. It was just a simple place, nothing fancy, but it was home. That day in late summer started like any other. The air was sticky with humidity, and the tobacco fields were ready for harvesting. My daddy had been working those fields since sunrise, and as evening approached, he let me, my older sister, Martha, and a couple of neighbor kids ride on the tractor with him as he headed back to the barn. I remember being so excited because Daddy didn't always let us ride along. The sun was setting, painting the sky all orange and pink. Daddy had the tractor headlights on as we bumped along that dirt road cutting between two sections of woods. I was sitting up front with him, my little legs dangling off the side, while Martha and the others were perched on the back. We were all chattering and laughing, covered in dirt from the day's work, but nobody cared. We were just happy to be outside in the cooling evening air. I remember exactly how it happened. The tractor was making that loud rumbling noise, and Daddy was humming some tune he always hummed when he was tired. Then suddenly, he slammed on the brakes so hard I nearly fell off. The tractor jerked to a stop, and for a second, nobody said anything. There, standing in the middle of our dirt road, directly in the beam of the tractor headlights, was something. Something that shouldn't have been there. Something that shouldn't even exist. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it. Was it a bear? A man in a costume? But deep down, I knew it wasn't either of those things. This creature was standing upright like a person would, but it was massive. My daddy was a big man, 6 feet tall and solid, but this thing towered over any person I'd ever seen. Its shoulders were impossibly wide, and its body was thick with muscle that you could see even in the dim light. What struck me most was its face. It wasn't completely covered in hair like the rest of its body. The skin there was lighter, almost grayish tan, and while it had features that reminded me of a human face, there was something deeply wrong about it. The eyes were set deep, and they were looking right at us, not with anger or fear, but with this awareness, like it was studying us. Its body was covered in short, dark hair, not shaggy like a bear, but more like a close coat. And its arms, God, its arms were all wrong. They hung down way too low with hands that reached below its knees. No person has arms like that. No animal I knew of had proportions like that. Nobody on the tractor made a sound. We were all frozen. I could hear Martha breathing fast behind me, and one of the neighbor boys started whimpering real quiet-like. The thing just stood there, looking at us for what felt like forever, but was probably only seconds. Then, without any rush, it took one long, smooth stride across the road and disappeared into the woods on the left side. Daddy kept the tractor running, but jumped off immediately. He told us in a stern voice I'd never heard before, "Stay put, don't move." Then he walked to the edge of the woods where the creature had vanished. He didn't go in deep, just stood there peering into the darkening forest for maybe half a minute. When he came back to the tractor, his face had changed. Daddy was always strong, always in charge, but right then, he looked shaken. He didn't say a word about what he'd seen or not seen. He just climbed back on, turned the tractor around, and drove us home faster than was safe on those bumpy roads. I remember Martha squeezing my hand so tight it hurt, but I didn't pull away. None of us spoke. We could feel something had shifted in the world we thought we knew. When we got back to the house, Daddy told Mama something in a low voice I couldn't hear. Her face went pale, and she herded us kids inside like chickens before a storm. Daddy grabbed his shotgun from above the fireplace, the one he only used for hunting season or when foxes got into the chicken coop, and headed back out. "Lock the doors," he told Mama. "Keep the kids inside." Mama tried to act normal, fixing us dinner and talking about ordinary things, but I could tell she was scared. She kept looking out the windows, and she jumped at every little noise. When my little brother asked where Daddy went, she just said he had to check on something in the fields. Daddy didn't come back until well after dark. I was supposed to be asleep, but I snuck out of bed and sat at the top of the stairs where I could hear them talking in the kitchen. Mama asked him if he found anything, and Daddy was quiet for so long I thought he wouldn't answer. "No tracks I could make sense of," he finally said. "Ground's too hard from the dry spell. But something went through those woods, Annie. Broke branches higher up than a man could reach." "What was it, John?" Mama's voice was shaking. "I don't know," he said, "but we're not letting the kids out alone until I figure it out." The next morning, Daddy laid down new rules. We weren't allowed to play in the woods anymore. We had to stay in the yard where the house was visible, and we had to come in before dusk. No exceptions. When I asked Daddy about what we saw, he just said it was probably a bear walking funny because it was injured. But I knew better. Bears don't walk on two legs for that long, and they don't have those awful long arms, and they don't look at you with eyes that understand. Martha and I whispered about it at night in our shared bedroom. "It was a monster," I said. "No such thing as monsters," she replied, but her voice wobbled when she said it. "Then what was it?" She didn't have an answer. The neighbor kids who were with us that day, they talked about it too. Billy Jenkins said it was Bigfoot, like from those tabloid papers his mama read. His older brother Tommy told him to shut up, that Bigfoot wasn't real. But Tommy had been on that tractor too, and I saw his face when that thing stepped out in front of us. He believed it was real, whatever name you gave it. Not even 2 months after what happened, Daddy announced we were moving to a different farm. It was only a few miles away, still close to the Yadkin River, but farther from those particular woods. He said it was because the new place had better soil and a bigger barn, but I always wondered if it was because of what we saw that evening. The new farm was nice enough, and eventually the rules about staying close to the house relaxed. Life went back to normal, or what passed for normal. We didn't talk about that evening with the creature. It became one of those family secrets that everybody knows, but nobody mentions. Years went by. I grew up, finished school, started working. Sometimes I'd almost convince myself that what I saw was just a child's imagination running wild, some ordinary thing transformed by fear and fading light into something monstrous. Then one morning in 1985, my older brother Jack called me. Jack was the practical one in the family, the one who never believed in ghost stories or superstitions. He was driving to the community college on Broadway Road before sunrise, and he was badly shaken. "Eliza," he said, his voice strained, "I saw something this morning, on the road." My skin went cold before he even explained. Somehow I already knew. "It was bigger than what you described," he told me, "standing right in the middle of the road in my headlights. But it had those same arms you talked about hanging down too low, and its face, God, Eliza, it looked at me like it knew me." Jack had been 12 when we moved farms. He hadn't been on the tractor that day with us. He'd always half believed our story, but thought we were exaggerating. Not anymore. It just stepped off the road, casual as anything, and disappeared into the trees, he said. "I sat there for 5 minutes before I could make myself drive past that spot." That's when I knew for certain what we saw that evening in 1967 wasn't a bear, wasn't a man, wasn't anything that had a name in our everyday world. It was real, and it was still out there in the woods of Davidson County. I've spent decades wondering about what we encountered. In the 90s, I started researching, reading everything I could find about similar sightings. People call them different things, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, wood apes, but the descriptions are always eerily similar. The height, the massive build, those impossibly long arms, that almost human face with eyes that seem too aware. Sometimes I drive out to our old property. New people live there now, and I wonder if they've seen anything strange in those woods. I wonder if they've heard heavy footsteps outside their windows at night, or found branches broken too high up for a person to reach. I wonder if they keep their children close when the sun starts to set. I'm an old woman now, and I've never seen that creature again. But I know it was real. My daddy wasn't a man who scared easily, but something about what he saw that day, or what he found when he went back with his shotgun, frightened him enough to move his family away from the farm he'd worked so hard to build. The thing that haunts me most isn't the creature itself, but the way it looked at us. Not like we were prey, not like we were a threat, but like it recognized us as thinking beings sharing the same land. There was an intelligence there that I wasn't prepared for as a 7-year-old girl, and that I'm still not sure I can fully comprehend as a grown woman. Whatever walked across that dirt road in the fading light of a summer evening in 1967, it's still out there somewhere. And sometimes, when I drive through rural Davidson County at dusk, I catch myself scanning the edge of the woods, half expecting to see a massive silhouette step out from between the trees and into the beam of my headlights. Those two long arms swinging at its sides, those knowing eyes finding mine once again. Story 16. I've never told this story online before. Even after all these years, I still get chills thinking about what happened at Spirit Lake. My wife and I have been avid hikers for most of our lives, and we've camped in some pretty remote places. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, compares to what we experienced in the Marble Mountains back in '99. It was late August, 1999. My wife Karen and I had planned a 7-day backpacking trip through the Marble Mountains wilderness in Northern California. We started at Lovers Camp Trailhead on a Tuesday morning. The weather was perfect, not too hot for August, with clear skies and just enough breeze to keep the mosquitoes away. We'd been looking forward to this trip for months. Both of us needed to disconnect from work and reconnect with each other, and the wilderness has always been our sanctuary. The first 2 days were exactly what we hoped for. The trails were challenging enough to be satisfying, but not brutal. We saw deer, countless birds, even a fox. We barely saw another human after the first few miles from the trailhead. By Thursday afternoon, we reached Spirit Lake, which was supposed to be the crown jewel of our trip. When we arrived at the lake around 2 in the afternoon, I remember feeling an immediate sense of awe. The water was incredibly clear, reflecting the surrounding pines and mountains like a mirror. We found a perfect spot about 20 feet from the shoreline, close enough for convenience but respecting the leave no trace distance guidelines. It took us about 30 minutes to set up our tent and organize our gear. Karen was excited to cool off, so she changed into her swimsuit while I rigged up my fishing gear. "I'm going to try to catch dinner," I told her. "I'll walk around the lake and see what I can find." The lake wasn't huge, maybe a half-mile across, but it was nestled in this bowl-like depression surrounded by pine forest. As I made my way around the perimeter, I started feeling off. It's hard to describe, but it was like that feeling when you think someone's watching you. I kept glancing back toward our campsite, where I could see Karen swimming near the shore. Then I'd scan the tree line on the opposite side, almost expecting to see someone standing there watching us. But that was the weird part. We hadn't seen another soul on the trail for 2 days. According to the ranger we'd spoken to before our trip, this area doesn't get much foot traffic, especially midweek. Still, I couldn't shake this feeling. Every few minutes, I'd look up from my fishing and stare across the lake, convinced I'd see someone emerge from the trees. By the time I made it back to camp with 2 decent-sized trout, the sun was starting to sink. Karen had gathered wood for a small cooking fire, and as I cleaned the fish, she mentioned something that sent a chill through me. "Hey, did you feel like you were being watched today?" she asked casually, arranging kindling in our fire pit. I looked up from the fish. "Actually, yeah, all afternoon. You too?" She nodded. "It was weird. I kept thinking someone was going to come walking out of the woods." We tried to laugh it off. Two city people getting spooked by the silence of nature, that sort of thing. But internally, I was unsettled that she'd felt it too. We cooked the fish over the fire, ate dinner, and watched the sunset turn the lake to gold. Before it got completely dark, we hung our food bag from a tree branch about 100 feet from our tent, standard procedure in bear country. We also had some clothes that had gotten wet during the day, swimsuits, socks, a couple t-shirts, so we laid them out on a fallen log near our tent to dry overnight. By 9:30, we were exhausted and crawled into our sleeping bags. The night was clear, and the temperature was dropping quickly. That's one thing about the mountains. Even in August, nights can get pretty cold. I remember lying there, listening to the wind in the pines and the occasional splash from the lake, probably fish jumping. I finally drifted off around 10. I don't know exactly what time it was when I woke up. Maybe 1 in the morning. It was the footsteps that jarred me awake. Heavy, deliberate, footsteps approaching our tent. Plodding is the best way to describe them, like something big and heavy was walking very purposefully toward us. My first thought was bear. We were in bear country after all. I nudged Karen, who was already awake and rigid beside me. We both lay completely still, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped about 10 feet from our tent. Then the strangest thing. We heard what sounded like a powerful stream of water hitting the ground. It lasted maybe 20 seconds. The sound was unmistakable. Something was urinating near our tent. A lot. The stream was so forceful we could hear it hitting the dirt. After it finished, the animal slowly walked away. We could hear its footsteps fading into the distance. Karen squeezed my hand so hard it hurt. "Bear?" she whispered. "Probably," I whispered back, but I wasn't convinced. The footsteps didn't sound quite right for a bear. They were too deliberate, too measured. Bears kind of shuffle and amble. This was different. We eventually fell back asleep, though it wasn't a deep sleep. Every little sound jolted me awake. Then, maybe around 3 in the morning, we heard it again. But this time, it wasn't the measured footsteps from before. This was something crashing through the underbrush, breaking branches, moving fast toward our camp from the forest. I sat bolt upright, grabbing the hunting knife I keep by my sleeping bag. Karen was pressed against me, both of us staring at the tent wall as if we could see through it. The crashing stopped at the head of our tent. Whatever it was right there, just a thin layer of nylon between us and it. We could hear it breathing, heavy, ragged breaths. Then it made a sound, a low, guttural grunt that I still hear in my nightmares. It wasn't a bear. I've heard bears before. This was something else. Neither of us moved. I don't think we even breathed. The thing stood there for what felt like forever, but was probably only a minute or two. Then it just walked, away, back into the forest. This time the footsteps were slow again, methodical. I'd like to say we were brave enough to look outside, but we weren't. We sat in that tent, wide awake, clutching each other until the first hint of dawn lightened the sky. Only then did I work up the courage to unzip the tent and peek out. The morning was eerily calm. Mist was rising off the lake. Birds were singing. It was actually beautiful. It would have been perfect if not for the knot of dread in my stomach. I stepped out of the tent cautiously, scanning the tree line. Nothing. I walked around our campsite and found some indistinct prints in the fine dirt near our tent. They resembled bear prints, but they weren't clear enough for me to be certain. Karen joined me, and we silently went about making coffee on our camp stove. Neither of us mentioned the night until she went to get our clothes from the log where we'd left them to dry. "Michael," she called, her voice tight, "come look at this." I walked over and immediately smelled it, a powerful, rank odor. Our clothes were soaked, not with dew or rain, but with urine. And not just any urine. This smell was unlike anything I've ever encountered. My dad used to make fox lure for trapping when I was a kid, which was basically concentrated fox urine, and it smelled awful. But this was worse, much worse. It was pungent, musky, almost primal. We looked at each other, and without saying a word, we knew we weren't staying another night. We grabbed the clothes with 2 sticks and carried them down to the lake. We washed them as best we could, though the smell never completely came out. We ended up throwing those clothes away when we got home. We packed up faster than we ever had before. No breakfast, no coffee, just stuffed everything into our packs and hit the trail. We hiked for 12 hours straight that day, bypassing our planned camp spot, pushing ourselves to get as far from Spirit Lake as possible. We barely talked, just kept moving. When we finally got back to civilization and cell service, I almost called the park rangers to report what had happened. But what would I say? That something peed on our clothes in the night? That we heard breathing and grunting? It sounded ridiculous, even to me. We tried to forget about it, chalked it up to wildlife, maybe a territorial bear. But a year later, I was browsing a local news site and saw something that made my blood run cold. A woman had gone missing at Spirit Lake in August 2000, almost exactly a year after our experience. The article mentioned that her campsite was found intact, but there was no sign of the woman. They conducted extensive searches but never found her. I've spent countless nights in the wilderness. I've encountered bears, mountain lions, even had a pack of coyotes circle my campsite once. But nothing has ever left me as shaken as whatever was at Spirit Lake. I'm not claiming it was Bigfoot or some other cryptid. I'm a rational person, but I'm also an experienced outdoorsman, and I know when something isn't right. To this day, Karen and I never go backcountry camping anymore. We stick to established campgrounds with other people around. Whatever was watching us, whatever circled our tent that night and marked our clothes, it's still out there in the Marble Mountains, and I have no intention of ever meeting it again.